Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel, I share real life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. The power went out while I was rinsing a mug in the sink. The kitchen lights cut off so cleanly that for half a second, I thought I'd blinked and missed something. The refrigerator stopped humming. The house settled into that quiet you only notice when it's forced on you. I stood there with my hands still under the tap, water running, until I realized the pump would probably cut too. I shut it off and listened. No distant traffic, no neighbor's TV through the walls, just my own breathing and the faint tick of cooling metal somewhere in the house. This kind of outage wasn't rare where I lived. I rented a small place on the edge of town, backed up to open fields and a line of trees that marked the start of state land. Storms knocked the power out a few times every summer. But this night was clear. No wind, no clouds. I'd been sitting on the couch 10 minutes earlier with the windows open because it was still warm out, listening to cicadas. I walked to the living room window and looked outside out of habit. The streetlights were off, all of them, down the entire road. Usually at least one house would still have a generator running, but everything was dark. My car sat in the driveway as a low shape, barely visible. That was when I noticed the sky. At first, I thought my eyes were just adjusting too fast. The sky looked wrong in a way I couldn't pin down immediately. It wasn't black like it should have been. It wasn't even that deep blue you get on clear nights. It was lighter, flat, almost reflective. I stepped out onto the porch. The sky had turned a dull silvery gray, not glowing exactly, more like the color of metal when it catches light, except there was no light source, no moon, no clouds reflecting city glow. The whole sky from horizon to horizon looked washed out and heavy, like a ceiling. The fields behind my house were still dark. The trees were dark, the ground was dark. It was just the sky. I remember thinking it looked close, lower than it should be. I stood there barefoot on the concrete, my hand resting on the doorframe. The air felt still but not calm. There was pressure in it, like when a storm is about to break but hasn't yet. My ears felt faintly clogged, the way they do when you drive up a mountain too fast. Somewhere down the road, a car door slammed. The sound carried farther than it should have. I glanced to my left and right, half expecting to see neighbors outside, pointing, talking. But no one else was out. No porch lights flicked on. No voices. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen lit up normally, full signal. No emergency alerts. The time looked right. I lifted it to take a photo, more out of instinct than anything else. Before I could tap the camera, the sky changed. It didn't fade gradually. It didn't flicker. The silvery gray pulled upwards, straight up, like a curtain being lifted from the horizon to directly overhead. The motion was smooth and fast. In less than a second, the sky was dark again. Normal. Stars visible. Empty. I stood there with my phone half raised, staring at nothing. A moment later, the streetlights snapped back on. One by one, all down the road, my porch light came back without me touching the switch. Inside, the refrigerator kicked on. The house filled with noise again. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 5 seconds. I stayed outside longer than I meant to, scanning the sky, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The stars looked normal. The air pressure eased, or maybe I just stopped noticing it. Eventually, I went back inside. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up and checking the time, listening for changes in the house. The power stayed on. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning at work, I mentioned the outage to my coworker Mark while we were getting coffee. "Did the power go out where you are?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not that I noticed. I was up late too." I asked a few other people. Some had lost power, some hadn't. No one mentioned the sky. That should have been the end of it. I told myself it was some weird atmospheric thing or my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. I let it go, mostly. Then it happened again. About a week later, same time of night, around 10:30, I was sitting on the couch, lights on, scrolling on my phone. The power cut out so abruptly that my TV went black mid-sentence. This time I felt it before I saw anything. That same pressure in the air, like the room had sealed itself. I stood up immediately and went to the window. Outside, the streetlights were already off. The sky had already changed. That same dull gray filled the view, uniform and heavy. It didn't shimmer. It didn't move. It just sat there, wrong. I didn't go outside this time. I stood in the doorway, barefoot on the rug, gripping the frame harder than I realized. I checked my phone. No signal now. The screen showed 0 bars. The time still ticked forward. I tried the camera anyway. The screen showed the gray sky, but flatter than it looked to my eyes, like it couldn't quite capture it. I noticed then that it was quiet in a different way. Not just no electricity. The insects were gone. No crickets, no distant dogs, nothing. I became very aware of how alone my house was. The sky lifted again, exactly the same way. Upward, smooth, fast. Darkness returned. Stars snapped back into place like someone had flipped a switch. The power came back a few seconds later. This time I checked my phone immediately. The signal returned. No missed alerts, no messages. The photo I thought I'd taken wasn't there. I slept on the couch with the lights on. After that, I started paying closer attention. The outages weren't on any schedule I could find, but they were always at night, always clear weather, always quiet. On the third time I was outside already, sitting on the porch with a beer. I felt the pressure shift and looked up just as the sky changed. I watched it without moving, forcing myself not to blink, trying to notice details. There were no clouds, no texture. The gray wasn't light coming from somewhere. It was like the absence of darkness. I realized something else then. The horizon line stayed where it was. The trees didn't silhouette against the gray. It was like the sky and the ground weren't interacting the way they normally did. My phone lost signal again. The screen dimmed slightly on its own. The sky lifted. The lights came back. I noticed my hands were shaking. I started checking local outage reports. Sometimes there was nothing listed at all. Sometimes there'd be a vague entry. Brief interruption. 'Cause unknown. I drove around one night after it happened, just to see if it was localized. The town looked normal. Lights on, people out, no gray sky. When I drove back toward my place, everything stayed normal. The next time it happened, I was in the shower. The water cut off mid-rinse. The bathroom went silent except for the ringing in my ears. I stepped out dripping and went to the window in a towel. The sky was already gray. That time, it lingered longer. Long enough for me to notice something else. The stars didn't disappear. They were still there, but dimmer, like they were being seen through a layer of frosted glass. I thought I saw movement up there. Not a shape, just a subtle shift, like something passing behind the gray. I didn't look away. The sky lifted. Everything came back. I checked the clock afterward. The power had been out for 7 minutes. I couldn't remember standing at the window for that long. The last time it happened was the one that finally pushed me to write this down. I was asleep. I woke up because the house felt wrong. That pressure, again, heavier than before. My ears rang softly. I sat up in bed and realized the power was off. I went to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The sky was gray. But this time, it wasn't uniform. There was a subtle gradient, darker in one area, like a shadow behind it. I felt watched in a way that didn't come from a direction I could point to. I stepped back from the window. The floor felt faintly warm under my feet. The sky lifted. The lights came back. I stood there in my bedroom, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the shadow. The next morning, my neighbor across the road asked me if my power had gone out again. I said, "Did you see the sky?" He frowned. "What sky?" I didn't push it. The power hasn't gone out again since. Weeks have passed. Everything looks normal, but now some nights when it's clear and quiet, I'll catch myself staring up at the stars, waiting for them to dim, waiting for the gray to come back down. And sometimes, for just a second, the sky looks thinner than it should be. The clicking started when I was halfway down the trail, just past the last house where the gravel road turned into dirt. It was late, maybe around 10:30. I'd gotten home from work restless, the kind where sitting still makes your skin feel tight. The weather was warm for early fall, clear sky, no wind. I figured a short walk wouldn't hurt. I'd done it 100 times. Same loop through the trees, out by the old utility easement, then back toward the neighborhood. The first click sounded like someone snapping their tongue once. I stopped walking without really thinking about it, head tilted. Everything else was normal. Crickets, distant traffic, my own breathing. No more clicking. I shrugged it off and kept going. A few steps later, it came back. Soft, quick, not loud. Click, click, click. It didn't sound close enough to be right next to me, but it also didn't feel far away. It was like it existed somewhere just outside where I could point to. I stopped again. Silence. I actually laughed, a short, nervous one, and said out loud, "Okay," like that explained it. I told myself it was an insect, or something echoing weird through the trees. Sound does strange things at night, I knew that. I walked again, slower this time. The clicking resumed almost immediately, but now it felt like it was moving. Not following behind me exactly, more like it was shifting around me. One click from the left, then another slightly ahead on the right. Never overlapping, never frantic, just patient. I stopped and looked up into the trees. The sound cut off so cleanly it was unsettling, like someone had flipped a switch. I stood there longer than I meant to, scanning the branches. The moon was bright enough that I could see leaves and empty sky between them. Nothing moved. No birds flushing, no squirrels scrambling. Even the crickets seemed quieter, like they were holding their breath. I told myself I was getting into my head. That happens when you walk alone at night. I checked my phone, 10:41. Still had signal, battery fine. I texted my friend Marcus something dumb like, "Night walks are creepy lol," and shoved the phone back into my pocket. As soon as I took another step, the clicking started again. This time it was closer. I felt it in my chest more than my ears, like a pressure change you notice before you hear thunder. The clicks weren't louder, just heavier. I stopped, looked up, silence. I tried something then. I took one step forward, then froze mid-step. The clicking cut out instantly, like it had been waiting for that exact moment. I didn't like that. I backed up a step instead of moving forward. The clicking came back, almost curious. 2 clicks, then a pause, then one more. My skin prickled. I turned slowly in a circle, trying to pinpoint anything. Movement, shadows that didn't belong. The trail behind me looked normal. The path ahead disappeared into darker trees. Above me was just sky and branches. I started walking faster. The clicking kept pace, not rushing, not falling behind. It circled me, staying just far enough away that I couldn't place it. Every time I glanced up, it stopped. Every single time. The silence after each look was wrong somehow, too empty, like sound itself had been pulled away. My heart was pounding now, but I didn't want to run. Running felt like the wrong move, like it would turn this into something else. I focused on my steps, counted them in my head. 30 steps in, something changed. The clicking stopped, but not the way it had before. It didn't cut off clean, it faded like someone slowly closing a door. At the same time, the air around me felt different, thicker. My ears popped slightly, the way they do when you go up a mountain too fast. For a second, I felt off balance, like the ground had shifted under me by a few inches. I stopped walking again. Above the trees, something moved. It wasn't bright at first, just a faint dimness, like a patch of sky that didn't match the rest. It slid sideways between the clouds, smooth and steady. No blinking, no sound, just motion. As I stared, it brightened slightly, enough that I could tell it wasn't a star or plane. It was too low, too controlled. The clicking didn't come back, but I could feel it then. This low, vibrating sense in my chest, like standing near heavy machinery. I whispered, "What the hell?" without meaning to. The thing above shifted position, not closer, not farther, just adjusted. The pressure in my ears increased for a second, then dropped away. The light vanished. Not like it turned off, more like it slipped behind something that wasn't there. The forest sounds came back all at once. Crickets, leaves, a car horn far off. I hadn't realized how quiet it had gotten until everything returned. I stood there shaking, staring at the empty sky. Nothing else happened. I didn't wait for it to start again. I turned around and walked back the way I came, fast but controlled, like if I moved too suddenly, I'd break some unspoken rule. I didn't hear the clicking again. I didn't look up. When I reached the gravel road, the street lights felt painfully bright, normal in a way that almost made me dizzy. I checked my phone again, 10:58. I frowned. That didn't make sense. I hadn't been out that long. The loop usually took 20 minutes, maybe 25 if I dragged my feet. I tried to piece it together in my head, but everything after the clicking started felt blurry, like time had folded in on itself. When I got home, my hands were still shaking. I locked the door, checked the windows, then checked them again. I stood in my living room for a long time, listening. No clicking, no hum, just the house settling. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, Marcus texted back asking what I meant about the night walk. I stared at the message for a while before replying something vague. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding like I'd lost it. I went back to the trail a few days later during the afternoon. Same path, same trees. Everything looked normal. I stood where I thought it had happened and listened. Nothing. But sometimes now, when I'm outside at night and everything goes quiet all at once, I get this strong urge not to look up. Like whatever caused the clicking is still there, waiting for me to notice it again. I was already halfway down Maple Ridge when I noticed the light. It was close to midnight, the kind of late where the neighborhood felt abandoned, but not asleep. Porch lights were off, windows dark, no traffic. I'd gone out for a walk because I couldn't focus at home. Too much noise in my head, not enough anywhere else. That stretch of road curved along a line of trees and empty lots, and I'd walked it enough times that my body knew it without thinking. I looked up because the sky felt brighter than it should have been. At first, it looked like a star slipping out from behind a cloud. One steady white point, not blinking, not pulsing. I didn't stop walking. I barely registered it. Planes crossed over all the time, and satellites were easy to spot if you paid attention, but something about it felt off. It was low. Lower than a satellite, but higher than any drone I'd seen, and it wasn't moving the way planes did. No straight line speed, no gradual fade. It was drifting. I slowed my pace without meaning to. The light slowed too. That got my attention. I stopped walking. The light stopped. Not faded, not dimmed, just paused. Suspended in the same spot above the trees like it had hit an invisible wall. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets, staring up. My first thought was that it was coincidence, perspective, some trick of depth and motion. Your brain loved doing that when it was tired. I took one step forward. The light moved, same direction, same speed. I stopped again. It stopped. A weird pressure settled in my chest like the air had thickened. Everything around me felt too still. No wind in the leaves, no insects. Even the distant highway noise seemed muted. I laughed quietly, more out of nerves than humor, and started walking again, deliberately this time. Faster. The light matched me perfectly. I slowed to a crawl. It slowed. I turned around and walked the other way. The light changed direction instantly, gliding back across the sky to stay aligned with me. That's when my stomach dropped. I wasn't being followed exactly. It didn't feel like something chasing me. It felt like something was anchored to my position. Like I was the thing moving and it was adjusting around me. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and craned my neck back until it hurt. The light waited. I checked my phone. No notifications. Signal was there, but the compass app spun for a second before settling in the wrong direction. I locked the screen and slipped it back into my pocket without trying to take a photo. I didn't want to break whatever weird balance had formed. I started walking again toward home this time. The light came with me. Every step I took, it slid across the sky. When I paused to retie my shoe, it froze. When I leaned forward, it shifted forward. When I stepped back, it adjusted backward. At one point, I crossed under a streetlight, and the glare forced me to look down. When I glanced back up, the light was still there, exactly where it should have been. The realization crept in slowly and made my skin prickle. It wasn't reacting to where I was. It was reacting to when I moved. I tested it. I took one step forward and stopped mid-stride, freezing with my foot hovering an inch above the ground. The light moved during that half step and then halted when I did. I felt suddenly exposed, like I'd stepped into a spotlight without realizing it. I kept going. The closer I got to my street, the more wrong everything felt. Houses I knew well looked flat and unfamiliar, like sets built too quickly. My footsteps sounded delayed, like the sound wasn't syncing up right. I stopped again, right at the corner. The light stopped. I stayed there longer this time. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing changed. I whispered, "Okay," to nobody. When I started walking again, the light followed like it had been waiting. I made it to my driveway and stood there, staring up at the patch of sky above my neighbor's roof where the light hovered. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what I expected it to do next, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside yet. I took one step backward. The light slid backward. I took 2 steps forward. It followed. I felt stupid standing there playing this silent game with something I didn't understand, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know where the boundary was. I turned and walked up the driveway. The lights stayed aligned until the roof blocked my view. I went inside and locked the door, leaning my forehead against it for a second. The house felt hollow, like it had been waiting too. I didn't sleep much that night. The next evening I told myself it had been stress, fatigue, my brain misfiring. I almost didn't go out, but the urge to check was stronger than the fear. I took the same route, same time, same weather. Nothing happened for the first 10 minutes. Then, just past the park, the light appeared again. Same brightness, same height. I stopped immediately. It stopped. There was no denying it anymore. I walked. It moved. I stopped. It froze. This time I stayed out longer. I walked in loops, doubled back, paused at random intervals. Each time, the light responded perfectly, like it was tied to some invisible marker above my head. I sped up to a jog. It kept pace. I slowed to a near standstill. It slowed too. It never drifted ahead, never lagged behind, never overshot. It felt less like it was watching me and more like it was tracking a variable, like movement itself was the trigger. At one point, I stood completely still for so long my legs started to ache. The light hung there unwavering. I felt an overwhelming sense of being observed, not in a personal way, but in the way a machine observes data. Neutral, detached, precise. I went home again. Same ending. As soon as I stepped inside, the light vanished. The third time it happened, something changed. I stopped walking in the middle of the street and didn't move for a long time. Cars didn't pass. Windows stayed dark. After maybe a minute, the light shifted, just slightly. It drifted sideways on its own, breaking the pattern for the first time. My heart jumped. It moved a little farther, then stopped, like it had decided to disengage. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a few seconds, it slid away toward the horizon and faded into the clouds. I stood there long after it was gone. I still go on late walks. I don't know why. Habit, maybe, or waiting. Sometimes I stop for no reason at all and stand perfectly still, listening to the quiet, watching the sky. When I do, I get this strange feeling, like I'm being measured again. So far, nothing has come back. The power went out while I was rinsing a mug in the sink. Everything just cut at once, no flicker, no warning, like someone had flipped a switch on the whole street. The kitchen dropped into this flat gray darkness, not pitch black, just dim enough that I could still see the counter edges. I stood there for a second, listening. No fridge hum, no AC. Even the distant highway noise seemed muted. I walked to the front window, wiping my hands on my jeans. A few houses down, I saw porch lights go dark one by one like they were all connected. Mrs. Calder's place across the street disappeared completely except for the pale rectangle of her living room window, where she still had candles burning. She always did that during outages. I checked my phone. No signal bars. Battery was fine, but everything felt delayed, like the screen brightness wasn't quite right. That's when I noticed the sky. It wasn't dark in the way a night sky usually was. It had this dull, silvery look to it, like someone had laid a thin sheet of metal over everything. No stars, no clouds, just this even, colorless glow stretching from horizon to horizon. At first, I thought it was light pollution doing something weird without the streetlights on, but the glow wasn't coming from below. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. I stepped out onto the porch. The air felt heavy, like right before a thunderstorm, but it was warm and still. No wind, no insects, no barking dogs. The entire street was quiet. I walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk, craning my neck back. The sky didn't move. It didn't pulse or shimmer. It just sat there, flat and wrong, like a ceiling too low overhead. A car was stopped in the middle of the intersection at the end of the block. The driver's side door was open, and a guy I didn't recognize was standing half in the road, staring straight up with his hands on his hips. I called out to him, but my voice sounded small and swallowed, like it didn't travel. He didn't respond. I took a few steps closer, and that's when the feeling hit me. Not fear exactly, more like awareness. Like something had shifted, and I was suddenly aware of being noticed, not by a person, but by the situation itself. Like when you realize you're being watched on a security camera, you can't see. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. The clock on the lock screen was stuck at 10:47. I don't know how long the sky stayed like that. It could have been seconds, it could have been minutes. There was no sense of time passing. My thoughts felt slow, like wading through thick water. Then, without any buildup, the glow faded, not downward or outward, just gone. The sky snapped back to normal darkness, stars blinking back into place like they'd been waiting. At the same moment, every porch light on the street came back on. The car at the intersection lurched forward, its headlights flaring like the driver had slammed the gas without meaning to. Somewhere a dog started barking, frantic and high-pitched. I realized I was holding my breath. I went back inside. The microwave clock was blinking 12. My phone buzzed all at once with missed notifications, like it had been buffering reality and finally caught up. I sat on the couch and waited for the adrenaline to fade, telling myself it was a weird outage, some atmospheric thing, maybe my brain filling in gaps. That worked for about 5 minutes. Then I noticed the time. The clock on the stove said 11:03. I checked my phone. Same thing. I knew it had been 10:47 when I first looked. I remembered the number clearly because it was close to the hour, and I'd thought about just going to bed early. I scrolled through my messages. There was a text from my sister sent at 10:55 asking if my power was out too. I didn't remember getting it. I didn't remember hearing the phone vibrate. I didn't answer it. I went to bed eventually, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound made me tense. The house felt too quiet, like it had lost its background noise and never quite got it back. Sometime during the night, I woke up sweating. The room was dark, but not fully. There was a faint glow leaking through the curtains, not bright enough to light the room, just enough to outline the dresser and the door frame. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. Nothing. No hum, no wind, no insects, just pressure. That was the only way I could describe it. Like the air itself was pressing down on me, not painfully, just insistently. I rolled onto my side and reached for my phone. The screen was already on, camera app open, pointed straight up. I sat bolt upright. The glow outside vanished instantly, like it had been cut off. Sound rushed back into the room all at once, the AC kicking on, a car passing somewhere far away, the faint buzz of electricity in the walls. My ears rang like I just stood up too fast. I looked at the phone again. There was one photo taken at 2:14 a.m. It showed my ceiling, and in the center of the frame, barely visible, was a soft silvery haze. Not a shape, not a reflection. Just a patch of light that didn't belong there. I checked the file info. No flash, no movement, just that single image. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, everything looked normal. The sky was blue, birds were loud. Mrs. Calder waved at me while watering her plants like nothing unusual had happened. I asked her if she'd noticed the sky during the outage. She frowned and said, "What do you mean?" I didn't push it. The photo is still on my phone. I haven't shown it to anyone. Every time I look at it, I get that same sense of pressure, like my body remembers something my mind doesn't. Sometimes late at night, when the house goes quiet again, I'll catch myself listening. Not for a sound, but for the absence of one. Like I'm waiting for the sky to go flat and metallic again. I was sitting on the back steps with my jacket zipped up, staring at the sky because I couldn't sleep. It was late enough that the neighborhood was quiet, but not dead. Somebody's dryer thumping a block over, a car passing every now and then. The air was cold and still, the kind that makes sound travel farther than it should. I lived outside of town then, just far enough that the streetlights didn't completely drown out the stars. I'd started doing this thing where I picked one star and watched it until my eyes got tired. It helped slow my thoughts down. If you stare long enough, the sky starts to feel less huge and more like a ceiling. I picked one low in the sky, just above the tree line. It wasn't especially bright, but it stood out because it didn't twinkle much. It felt steady, solid. I remember thinking it was probably a planet, but I didn't bother checking. I watched it for a while, and so waft breathing fog into my sleeves, counting my exhales. Nothing happened at first. The night felt normal. Too normal, honestly. Then the star moved. Not fast, not sudden. It slid sideways, smooth and quiet, like someone nudging a chess piece across a board. Just a little bit at first. I thought it was my eyes, so I blinked hard and looked away at the roofline, then back. It was still drifting. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Not panic, more like confusion so deep it felt physical. Stars don't do that. planes blink, satellites glide. This didn't glide. It adjusted, corrected itself slightly, like it was staying level with something I couldn't see. I stood up without realizing I was doing it. The wood step creaked under my boot, loud as a gunshot. The star kept moving. I whispered no under my breath, like that would somehow stop it. It slid another inch across the sky, then slowed. For a second, just one, I couldn't tell if I was looking at movement or if my brain was filling it in. The star dimmed slightly, not enough to vanish, just enough to feel thinner, and then it blended back into the sky. That's the only way I can describe it. It didn't turn off, it didn't shoot away. The point of light softened, spread out, and suddenly it was just gone. Or maybe it was still there, and my eyes couldn't separate it from everything else anymore. I stood there with my mouth open, staring at the spot where it had been. The sky looked normal, completely normal. I checked other stars, comparing positions, trying to convince myself I'd picked the wrong reference point. I hadn't. My hands were shaking, not badly, but enough that I noticed. I pulled my phone out and opened a star map app, feeling stupid even as I did it. The app showed the sky exactly as it should be. No gaps, no missing points. I stayed outside another 10 minutes, then 20. Nothing else happened. The cold started to creep through my jacket, and my rational brain slowly clawed its way back in. I went inside and locked the door, which I didn't usually do that early. I stood in the kitchen for a bit, just listening. The house sounded the same as it always did. Fridge humming, pipes ticking. I told myself it was an illusion. Fatigue, eye strain, maybe a satellite at a weird angle. I repeated that explanation until it almost sounded reasonable. Almost. The next night, I went back out. I didn't plan to. I told myself I wouldn't. But around the same time, my body just expected something, like a habit I hadn't meant to form. It was cloudier that night. The stars were patchy, coming and going behind thin gray streaks. I sat on the steps again, hugging a mug I didn't really want, scanning the sky without focusing too hard. I didn't see the same star. At least, I don't think I did. What I did notice was how quiet it felt, not silent, just muted. The crickets had stopped, which happens sometimes, but even the distant road noise felt dampened, like someone had closed a door somewhere far away. Then one of the stars near the center of my view dimmed, not disappeared, just dulled like a light behind fog. I leaned forward, squinting. It shifted sideways. This one moved faster. Not dramatically, but enough that I couldn't pretend it was my eyes. It slid, paused, then slid again, always smooth, always controlled. No blinking, no trail. I felt that same pressure in my chest, like when an elevator stops too abruptly. I pulled my phone up again, hands clumsy, and as soon as the screen lit my face, the star stopped moving. It just stayed there. I lowered the phone slowly, watching the sky over the top edge. The star held still for a few seconds, then faded back into the background exactly like the night before. I didn't stay outside after that. I went straight to bed, locked the door again, and lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying it over and over, every time I thought I had it pinned down. Some natural explanation, some trick of light, it slipped away. Over the next week, it happened 3 more times. Not every night. Not at the same spot in the sky. Always subtle. Always brief. A star that drifted when it shouldn't. A point of light that thinned and vanished without actually going anywhere. Once I was with someone else. My neighbor Mark was over, helping me move a broken shelf out to the curb. We finished up and stood there talking, both of us looking up without really meaning to. I saw at first a star just above the power lines, steady and bright. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you see that one?" Mark followed my gaze. "Yeah." The star slid, just a little. "Is it moving?" I asked. He frowned. "I don't think so." It moved again, a clean sideways shift, unmistakable. "There," I said. "That?" Mark squinted. "I don't see." The star dimmed and blended into the sky mid-sentence. Mark looked at me. "See what?" I didn't answer right away. I was still staring at the empty space, my heart pounding so hard it felt loud. "Never mind," I said finally. "Probably nothing." He shrugged and went back inside. I stayed out a bit longer, staring at a sky that suddenly felt like it was paying attention to me. After that, I stopped going outside at night. I closed the curtains earlier. I kept lights on. I tried not to look up when I walked to my car. It sounds ridiculous, but there was something about those movements that felt intentional. Not directed at me exactly. More like reactive, like when you notice someone across a room notice you back. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. My nerves settled. I started sleeping better. The explanations I'd rehearsed hardened into something I could almost believe. Then one night, lying in bed, I noticed the light in the room shift. Not brighter, not darker, just thinner. Like the air itself had changed density. I sat up, heart racing, and the feeling vanished instantly. Everything went back to normal. The house creaked. The heater kicked on. I didn't look out the window. I don't know what those stars were. I don't know if they were stars at all, or something passing in front of them, or something using them as cover. I don't know why they moved the way they did, or why they seemed to stop when I tried to capture them. All I know is that sometimes when I catch myself staring at the sky for too long, I feel that same quiet pressure in my chest, and I force myself to look away before anything has the chance to move again. The compass started buzzing in my hand like a trapped insect. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe my fingers were shaking from the cold. I stopped walking and held it out flat, waiting for the needle to settle. Instead, it quivered in place, a tight little vibration that I could feel through the metal casing. Then it snapped to a stop, pointing uphill. Not north, not anywhere that made sense, just straight up the trail. I stood there for a second, listening. The forest was quiet in that normal high-altitude way. No wind through the trees, no birds, no bugs. It was late morning, cloudy but bright, and cold enough that my breath showed when I exhaled. I was hiking alone near Monarch Pass, a trail I'd done before. Nothing technical, just a long, steady climb above tree line if you stuck with it. I'd planned to turn around before noon. I tapped the compass with my thumb. The needle didn't move. I pulled my phone out to check GPS, but there was no signal. That wasn't unusual up there, so I put it back in my pocket and told myself the compass was busted. Cheap gear, that's all. I started walking again. About 50 yards up the trail, I noticed the air ahead looked wrong. It wasn't fog. It wasn't dust. It looked like heat distortion, the kind you see over asphalt in summer, except it was March and cold enough that the ground was crusted with old snow in places. The shimmer hung just above the tree line, maybe 30 feet off the ground, stretching horizontally like a thin veil. The trees behind it looked slightly warped, like I was seeing them through moving glass. I slowed down without really deciding to. The trail was empty. No voices, no footsteps. I hadn't seen anyone else since the trailhead. I remember thinking it would make sense if there was wind up there. But there wasn't. My jacket hung still. The tops of the pines didn't move. I reached the spot where the compass had frozen and stopped again. The shimmering didn't move. It didn't pulse or glow. It was just there. Subtle enough that if I hadn't been looking straight at it, I might have missed it completely. I raised my hand and waved it slowly in front of my face, like I was checking for heat coming off a fire. Nothing. The air felt the same as everywhere else. Cold, thin, dry. I took another step. The sound stopped. I didn't notice it at first because it was the absence of something. No crunch of gravel under my boots. No rustle from my pack straps. Even my breathing sounded muffled, like my ears were clogged. I froze mid-step. The shimmer was closer now. Or maybe I was. It was hard to judge distance. The trees behind it seemed flatter, less real, like a backdrop. I tried to swallow and felt the motion echo strangely in my head, like a delayed response. I took my phone out again. Still no signal, but the screen lit up. The time read 11:42. I blinked and checked again. Same time. I don't know why that bothered me as much as it did. I hadn't been hiking that long, but it felt like more than a few minutes had passed since I last checked. I turned around. The trail behind me looked normal. Same trees, same rocks, same gentle curve down toward the valley. Sound existed back there. I could hear my own breath again, faint but present. I took one step backward. The sound came back fully, like someone had turned the volume knob back up. Wind whispered through the trees. A bird called somewhere far off. Gravel crunched under my boot. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the line in the air. I told myself it was some kind of atmospheric thing, temperature inversion, light refraction, something boring and explainable that I just didn't understand. I took another step forward. The silence snapped back instantly. This time, I felt something else. A low pressure in my chest. Not painful, just present. Like standing too close to heavy machinery or being inside a large building when the HVAC kicks on. The shimmer thickened slightly, not brighter, just more defined. I had the sudden, very clear thought that if I took one more step, I wouldn't be able to step back. I don't know where that thought came from. It didn't feel like panic, it felt calm, observational, like a fact. My compass buzzed again in my hand, even though I hadn't realized I was still holding it. I looked down. The needle wasn't vibrating anymore. It was perfectly still, pointing straight ahead, up the mountain. I don't remember deciding to turn around. I just did it. One smooth movement, careful not to look back again. As soon as my back was to it, the pressure eased. Sound returned completely. My heart was hammering now, and my hands felt shaky and weak. I walked downhill fast, but not running. I kept expecting to hear something behind me. Footsteps. A voice. Anything. There was nothing. After a few minutes, I checked my phone again. 11:42. That's when the fear really hit. I stood there on the trail, staring at the screen. The seconds weren't ticking. The display was frozen, just like the compass had been. I turned the phone off and back on. When it rebooted, the time jumped to 12:19. I felt dizzy, like I'd stood up too fast. The rest of the hike down was uneventful, but everything felt slightly off. The colors seemed flatter, the sky looked too close. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shimmer following me through the trees. At the trailhead, there were cars parked that hadn't been there earlier, a couple unloading gear, a man tightening his boots. Normal stuff. The sound of voices felt grounding in a way I didn't realize I needed. I almost asked someone if they'd seen anything strange up the trail. I didn't. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with notifications that had apparently been waiting. Missed texts. A voicemail from my sister asking how the hike was going. When I got home, I noticed my boots were dusty, but the laces were wet, like I'd been standing in damp grass. There hadn't been any wet ground on the trail. That night, I dreamed about standing on the mountain, looking up at a sky with no depth, just a smooth, pale surface stretching forever. When I woke up, my chest felt heavy, like it had when I'd stepped toward the shimmer. I checked my compass before bed the next night. The needle spun freely, like normal. I haven't gone back to that trail. Sometimes when I'm outside on cold, clear days, I catch myself scanning the tree line without meaning to, looking for that slight distortion in the air. And every now and then, when the wind drops just right, the world goes very quiet for half a second longer than it should. When that happens, I don't move until the sound comes back. I woke up already sitting halfway up in bed, heart going hard like I'd been running. The room was dark and quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing too clearly. I had that exact feeling you get when you're sure someone's in the room with you, even though you can't see anything. I stayed still and listened. Nothing moved. No floorboards, no doors. The house was the same as it always was at night, old, creaky, and settled. But the feeling didn't go away. It was strong enough that my eyes kept drifting to the corner near the dresser, like I expected something to step out of it. I turned my head toward the window instead. That's when I noticed the light. It wasn't bright. It wasn't even clearly defined, just a faint glow outside, low to the ground, like someone holding a dim lantern far away. It sat just beyond the tree line at the back of my property, barely visible through the branches. As soon as I focused on it, it moved. Not fast. It slid sideways and dipped, like it was backing away. By the time I swung my legs off the bed and crossed the room, it was already retreating behind the trees, shrinking until it was gone. I pressed my face close to the glass and scanned the yard. Nothing. No flashlights. No headlights. No movement in the brush. The trees stood still, their outlines sharp against the sky. I checked the time on my phone. 3:41 a.m. I stood there longer than I meant to, waiting for something else to happen. It didn't. By the time I went back to bed, the feeling had dulled but not disappeared. I slept in short, shallow stretches until my alarm went off. In the morning, the yard looked normal. Dew on the grass, fallen leaves along the fence line. I walked the perimeter with a mug of coffee, half expecting to find footprints or some sign that someone had been back there. There was nothing. I live alone on a few acres outside a small town in western Pennsylvania. My nearest neighbor, Mark, is about a quarter mile down the road. We wave when we see each other, borrow tools once in a while. That's it. I told myself it was probably a car on the road beyond the woods. or my brain filling in gaps after a bad dream. That explanation worked until the next night. The second night, I didn't wake up suddenly. I drifted out of sleep slowly, aware first of a low pressure in my ears, like the start of a headache. Then the same feeling crept in, that sense of being watched. I didn't move right away. I kept my eyes closed, listening. That's when I noticed the sound was wrong. Not silence, something softer, like the house had been wrapped in insulation. The usual background noise, distant highway hum, insects, the refrigerator cycling, was muted, flattened. I opened my eyes and turned my head toward the window. The glow was back. This time it was a little higher, hovering just above the tree line. Still dim, still without any clear source. It pulsed once, faintly, like a slow breath. I got out of bed faster than I meant to and crossed the room. The floor creaked loudly under my feet, and the sound seemed to snap the moment in half. The light dropped straight down and vanished behind the trees. Immediately, the night sounds rushed back in. Crickets, wind, the distant bark of a dog. I stood there with my hands on the window frame, trying to steady my breathing. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. I work at a small print shop in town, mostly alone in the afternoons. Every time a machine kicked on behind me, I flinched. I checked my phone more than usual, half expecting a missed call or message explaining something I didn't understand yet. I didn't tell anyone. Saying it out loud felt like giving it more weight. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I watched TV with the lights on and didn't go to bed until after midnight. When I finally did fall asleep, it was deep and heavy. I woke again at 3:41. The number hit me immediately. Same time. This time the light was closer. It hovered between two trees at the edge of the yard, low enough that I could make out the way it blurred slightly against the branches behind it. It didn't pulse, it just hung there. My chest felt tight, like I'd run out of room to breathe. I raised my phone and snapped a photo through the glass. The screen showed nothing but darkness. When I looked back up, the light slid backward, slow and smooth until the trees swallowed it. I didn't sleep after that. The following morning, Mark drove up while I was taking out the trash. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Lights were on late." "Yeah," I said automatically. "Just couldn't sleep." He hesitated. "You been seeing anything weird back here at night?" My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" I asked. He scratched his beard. "Couple nights ago, I let my dog out and thought I saw a glow near your trees. Figured it was you." I didn't answer right away. I could hear my pulse in my ears. "It wasn't," I said finally. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what I figured." After that, the nights changed. Sometimes I didn't wake up at all. Other times I woke with that pressure in my ears, but no light outside. Once I woke to find my phone unlocked on the nightstand. Camera app open, pointed at the ceiling. The light came back 3 more times that week, always around the same time, always retreating as soon as I moved. One night I stepped outside. The air felt thick, like it had weight. The yard was darker than usual. The stars dimmed above my house, but brighter farther away. I stood barefoot in the grass, heart pounding, and waited. Nothing appeared. After a minute, the pressure in my ears eased. The stars returned to normal. I went back inside, shaking. The light never crossed into the yard. It never approached the house. It stayed just far enough away to be seen, then gone. A week later, it stopped. No light, no pressure, no waking at 3:41. Life slid back into place. Work, sleep, quiet nights. Sometimes when I stand at the window before bed, I look toward the trees and feel that old sense of attention brush past me, faint and fleeting. Nothing shows itself anymore. But every so often, I wake just before dawn with the feeling that something has finished watching and finally left. I was driving west on Route 26, the long, empty stretch that cuts through scrub and low hills before the land flattens out. It was late, not quite night yet, but the sun was gone and the sky had that deep blue color that makes everything feel farther away than it is. The weather was clear and still. No wind. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every sound your car makes. I'd been on the road for a couple of hours, coming back from visiting my sister, and I was tired in that dull, floaty way where your thoughts start to wander. I turned the radio on mostly to stay awake. There wasn't much on. A country station faded in and out, then static, then nothing. I didn't bother fixing it. I let it scan. That was when I noticed the sound. Between stations, instead of just static, there was a faint tone. Not loud, not sharp. It came in pulses, steady and even, like a slow electronic heartbeat. It wasn't music, no melody, just a soft repeating at the same interval. At first, I thought it was something wrong with the speakers. I tapped the dash with my knuckles. The tone didn't change. I adjusted the volume. It got louder and quieter, but the rhythm stayed perfect. I glanced at the display. The radio was still scanning, sliding through empty frequencies, but the tone stayed there, sitting underneath everything else. When a station briefly came in, the tone dropped out. As soon as it faded, the tone returned. I remember thinking it sounded intentional, like it was being broadcast on purpose, but not meant to be heard directly. The road was empty in both directions. No headlights ahead, none behind. Just my car cutting through the dark. After a few minutes, I started to feel irritated by it. The repetition got under my skin. I reached to turn the radio off, then stopped. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Or that quiet sense that if I interrupted it, I'd miss something. I kept driving. The land opened up on the right side, where the hills dropped away into a wide basin. I could see miles out there. The horizon was a clean line, dark earth against darker sky. That's when I noticed the light. It was far away, low and faint, sitting just above the horizon. At first, I thought it was a town. There were a few small ones out that way, but this light wasn't spread out. It was a single glow, soft-edged and steady, like a distant dome. It didn't flicker. It didn't move. It just sat there. The tone on the radio continued, perfectly in time. I checked my mirrors. Still no cars. I looked at my phone on the passenger seat. No signal. That wasn't unusual out there, but I remember noticing it anyway. As I drove, the light slowly lowered, not like it was setting, more like it was sinking. The horizon didn't change. The light did. The tone on the radio began to feel louder, even though I hadn't touched the volume. I could feel it more than hear it, a gentle vibration through the steering wheel and the seat. It wasn't unpleasant, just noticeable. I tried to time it. The pulse matched nothing I recognized. Not my turn signal. Not the engine. It was its own thing. I told myself it was a radio tower and atmospheric interference. I said it out loud, just to hear a human voice. The words sounded thin in the car. The light continued to sink. I realized then that I'd passed the turnoff I usually used. The reflective sign was a mile back, barely visible in my rearview mirror. I didn't remember seeing it at all. That bothered me more than the light. I slowed down slightly, heart starting to pick up, and watched the glow. As it dropped closer to the horizon, the tone on the radio stretched out. The rhythm stayed the same, but each pulse seemed to linger longer, like it was dragging. My ears felt full, like when you change elevation too fast. The light reached the horizon and paused. Half of it was gone now, like it was being swallowed by the land. The remaining half dimmed but didn't change shape. The tone stopped, not faded, not cut off, just stopped, mid-pulse. The sudden silence was so complete that I flinched. The radio was still on, still scanning, but now it was just static and empty air. A second later, the light slipped fully below the horizon and vanished. I pulled over without really deciding to. The car rolled onto the shoulder and I shut off the engine. The quiet pressed in immediately. No insects, no wind, no distant highway noise. It felt like everything had taken a step back. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, listening to my own breathing. After maybe 30 seconds, sound returned in pieces. A faint breeze, the ticking of the cooling engine. Somewhere far off, a low rumble that might have been another car miles away. I turned the radio off completely. I stayed there for a while, staring at the horizon, waiting for the light to come back. It didn't. The sky darkened normally, stars starting to show. When I finally drove again, I was more alert than I'd been all night. I didn't miss any more signs. The turnoff appeared where it should, bright and obvious, like it always was. I got home without incident. The next morning, I checked the car. The radio worked fine. No weird sounds. No memory of the tone saved anywhere. I drove back the same route a week later during the day. Nothing unusual. Just scrub and sky. I didn't tell my sister about it. I didn't write it down right away. I kept thinking I'd remember it wrong if I waited too long. Sometimes now, when I'm driving late and the radio scans between stations, I hold my breath for a second, just to see if that rhythm comes back. Every light in the park went out at the same time. I was halfway down the main path, the one that cuts through the center with the old oak trees and the benches that always smell faintly like rain. It was just after 9, late enough that most people were gone, but not so late that it felt unsafe. The sky was overcast, low clouds glowing faintly orange from the city. The air was warm and still, that kind of summer night where sounds carry farther than they should. The lights didn't flicker, they didn't dim. They shut off like someone flipped a single switch. The path disappeared under my feet. The trees collapsed into one dark mass. For half a second, my eyes didn't know what to do with it. I stopped walking automatically, heart jumping, waiting for my vision to catch up. That was when I noticed how quiet it got. Not peaceful quiet. More like the sound had been muted. I couldn't hear traffic from the street anymore, even though it was only a block away. The cicadas that had been buzzing nonstop went silent all at once. I could hear my own breathing too clearly. Someone laughed nervously behind me. "Did that just happen?" a guy said somewhere to my left. I turned, trying to place voices in the dark, but the shadows felt thicker than they should have. The glow from the city should have been enough to outline people. It wasn't. Then I looked up. The clouds were moving, but not the way clouds usually do. One section of darkness slid across them, smoother and faster, like a shadow passing over frosted glass. It didn't have a clear edge, but it blocked out the faint orange glow behind it completely. It wasn't shaped like anything I could name. Not round, not angular, just wrong in a way that made my eyes keep sliding off it. Someone near the benches whispered, "Is that a helicopter?" There was no sound. No chop of blades. No hum. Nothing. The dark shape moved from west to east, directly overhead. As it passed, the air felt heavier, like the pressure drop before a storm, except it didn't come with wind. My ears popped slightly. I swallowed and felt it in my jaw. My phone buzzed in my hand, making me flinch. I hadn't realized I was gripping it. No notification, just a vibration like it had lost signal and found it again. The shape crossed the park in maybe 3 seconds. The instant it cleared the far side, every light snapped back on. Path lights, lampposts, the old decorative lanterns near the playground. All of it, bright and normal, like nothing had happened. The cicadas started up again, mid-buzz, not ramping up, just continuing like they'd never stopped. Traffic noise rushed back in, too loud for a second before settling. People stood frozen where they were. A woman near the path said, "What the hell was that?" No one answered her. A couple with a stroller hurried toward the exit without looking back. The guy who'd laughed earlier pulled his phone out and started filming the sky, even though there was nothing there now but clouds. I stayed where I was, staring up, waiting for my pulse to slow down. It didn't. After a minute or two, people started talking over each other, trying to fill the silence. Power outage. Transformer. City grid glitch. Someone joked about aliens, but it came out thin and forced. I walked home as soon as my legs remembered how. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time a car passed outside my apartment, I woke up, convinced the sound had stopped again. The next morning, the city's outage map showed nothing. No reports, no maintenance logs. I checked local news sites. Nothing. I went back to the park the following evening, telling myself I needed to see it in daylight. Everything looked normal. The grass was a little worn near the benches where people had clustered. That was it. I tried to convince myself it was a one-off. Some freak electrical thing combined with my imagination filling in gaps. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was sitting on a bench near the pond, scrolling through my phone. A guy named Marcus was tossing a tennis ball for his dog a little ways off. I remember his name because he'd introduced himself earlier when the dog decided my shoe was a toy. The lights went out exactly the same way. Instant. Total. The dog froze mid-run, ball rolling to a stop beside it. It didn't bark. It didn't move. Just stood there, staring upward. Marcus said, "Hey," sharply, like he was scolding it. I looked up just in time to see the dark shape again. It was lower this time. I could tell because it blocked out more of the sky, and the sense of pressure was stronger, like something heavy passing just above the treetops. I stood without realizing I was doing it. The shape didn't cast a shadow the way you'd expect. The darkness seemed contained within it, like it was subtracting light rather than blocking it. As it passed overhead, my phone screen went black. Not off, black. The glow disappeared, but the device stayed warm in my hand. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain on hot pavement, even though it hadn't rained. The lights snapped back on. Marcus swore loudly. Okay. Nope, we're leaving. His dog bolted the second the lights came back, nearly yanking the leash out of his hand. Other people reacted faster this time. Joggers broke into sprints. A couple near the pond climbed the path toward the street without saying a word. I stood there a few seconds longer, staring at the empty sky. My phone restarted itself with a chime. I checked the time. I was missing 4 minutes. Not skipped notifications, not a frozen screen. The system clock showed a clean jump. I checked my step tracker out of habit. There was a gap there too. No data, just a flat line. I didn't tell anyone about that part. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing smaller things. Lights in the park would dim for half a second, then return to normal. The air would go still without warning. Sounds would drop out for a beat, then resume slightly out of sync, like an audio track catching up. Once, walking through at dusk, I felt that pressure again and looked up just in time to see the clouds ripple, like something had passed between layers. No blackout that time, just the feeling. I stopped going through the park at night after that. Months passed. I was almost convinced it was over when it happened a third time, earlier than before. Late afternoon. Kids still on the playground. Clear sky. Every light went out. People screamed that time. I didn't see the shape clearly, just a dark movement overhead, faster than before. Purposeful. The lights came back on immediately. No missing time, no phone issues. Parents grabbed kids, someone called 911. I left before anyone could start asking questions. I still live nearby. Sometimes late at night, I hear the park go quiet from my apartment window. Not silent, just muted. When that happens, I don't look up. I wait for the lights I can't see from here to come back on, and I try not to think about how something that large could move that smoothly without making a sound. I still walk through the park during the day, but I never stay after dark anymore, and I don't trust the sky when it looks too still. The humming was already there when I realized I was awake. It wasn't loud enough to wake me on its own. It felt more like I'd surfaced out of sleep and noticed it waiting for me. Low, steady, almost gentle. Not a mechanical buzz, not a ringing, somewhere between those. If I tried to focus on it, it slipped away a little, like my ears couldn't lock onto the frequency. I lay still and listened. The room was dark except for the faint orange glow from the streetlight outside my window. Rain had been falling earlier, but that had stopped. I knew that because I couldn't hear it anymore. I couldn't hear much of anything, actually. No cars, no wind, no refrigerator hum from the kitchen, just that other sound. I rolled onto my side and pressed my ear into the pillow, then lifted my head again. The humming didn't change. It didn't get louder or quieter. It didn't feel like it was coming from the walls or the ceiling or outside the window. It felt like it was everywhere, evenly distributed, the way pressure feels when you go underwater. I checked my phone, 2:14 a.m. The screen light felt harsh, like my eyes were more sensitive than usual. I turned the brightness down and sat up slowly, listening for any change. Nothing. I stood and padded across the room, barefoot, the floor cold in a way that felt sharper than normal. As I crossed near the window, I noticed the curtains weren't moving at all. No breeze. They hung perfectly still. The humming continued. I pulled the curtain back an inch and looked outside. The street looked wrong, but I couldn't have explained how if I'd been asked. The houses were there, the parked cars, the trees lining the sidewalk. Everything was in place. But the shadows didn't seem deep enough, like the contrast had been flattened. The street light was on, but it didn't seem to be lighting anything. The glow sat there, contained, not spilling the way it usually did. I watched for a minute, then realized I was holding my breath. That's when the humming stopped. Not faded, not wound down. It cut off cleanly, like someone flipped a switch. The silence that followed wasn't normal silence. I know how that sounds, but it's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't quiet the way the middle of the night usually is. It felt empty, like sound itself hadn't fully come back yet. I waited for the refrigerator to kick on, for a car to pass, for something. Nothing happened. My ears felt full, like after a loud concert, except there hadn't been any loud noise. I swallowed a few times, trying to pop them. It didn't help. Then, very slowly, the normal sounds returned. First the refrigerator, then a distant car. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once. I stood there, still holding the curtain, heart beating way too fast. I went back to bed and lay there until sunrise, afraid to fall asleep again. The next morning, everything looked fine. My apartment felt normal. The world sounded normal. I went to work and almost managed to convince myself it had been some half-awake thing, my brain misfiring. That night, it happened again. Same time, same humming, same sudden stop. On the third night, I tried recording it. I left my phone on my nightstand with the voice memo app running before I went to sleep. When I woke up around 2, the humming was there again, steady and calm, like it had always been. I didn't move. I just reached over and checked the screen. The recording was still going. When the humming stopped, I waited a full minute before stopping the recording. The next morning, I listened to it. There was nothing. Not silence, exactly. Just the usual low-level noise a microphone picks up in a quiet room. No hum. No change when I remembered the sound stopping. The waveform was flat the whole time. I tried not to spiral about it. Instead, I started noticing other things. One morning, my neighbor Claire mentioned she'd slept terribly because of a weird vibration she couldn't explain. She laughed it off, but she looked tired. Another neighbor, Tom, asked if anyone else had been hearing noises at night. He couldn't describe it either. A few nights later, I woke up just before the humming started. I knew it was about to happen because my room felt different, heavy, like the air had thickened. I sat up and watched the ceiling. The hum came back, right on time. This time, I noticed something else. My ceiling fan, which I always left on low, had stopped. The blades were frozen mid-spin. I stared at them, then slowly reached for the light switch on the wall. When I flipped it, nothing happened. The hum continued. I don't know why I did it, but I walked into the living room. My apartment felt bigger than it should have, like the walls had moved back a few inches. The hum made it hard to think clearly, like it was pressing on my thoughts. I looked out the front window. The streetlight across from my building was off. So were all the others. The entire block was dark, lit only by that flat, dim glow from the sky itself. I couldn't see stars, I couldn't see clouds, just a dull gray-black ceiling overhead. Then something passed above my building. I didn't see a shape. There was no outline. What I saw was the absence of stars moving, like a shadow sliding across something that should have been there. The hum deepened for a moment, just enough that I felt it in my chest. Then it stopped. The streetlights snapped back on. My ceiling fan resumed spinning, jerking slightly as if it had been interrupted mid-motion. Sound rushed back into the world all at once. I stood there shaking, hands clenched at my sides, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I checked the time. 2:17 a.m. My phone said 2:09. I stared at both numbers until they blurred. After that night, it stopped happening every day. Sometimes it would skip a night, sometimes 2, but it always came back. The last time it happened, I noticed something I hadn't before. When the humming stopped and the silence set in, I snapped my fingers. The sound didn't echo. It didn't even feel like it existed properly, like it was absorbed before it could travel. That scared me more than anything else. It's been a few weeks now. I still wake up sometimes around 2, heart racing, listening for that sound. Most nights it doesn't come. But sometimes, just as I'm drifting off, my room goes a little too quiet and I lie there wondering if the hum has already started and I just can't hear it yet. The first night I noticed it, I was standing on the back deck with a beer, trying to decide if the mosquitoes were bad enough to make me go back inside. I'd rented the cabin for a week because I hadn't taken real time off in years. No cell service, no nearby neighbors, just a small lake tucked into a bowl of trees in northern Minnesota. The kind of place where the water goes black after sunset and the air smells like pine and damp soil. It was a little after 10 p.m. The sun had gone down, but there was still a faint glow on the horizon. I was looking across the lake, not really thinking about anything, when a light appeared above the far shore. Just one. Bright white. Steady. About the size of a star, but lower, too low. I assumed it was a plane at first, maybe lining up for some distant airport, but it didn't move. It just hung there, a few degrees above the tree line. I waited for the reflection to show up on the water. It never did. The lake stayed dark, perfectly flat, reflecting the dim sky and the outline of trees, but no streak of light, no shimmer, nothing. That bothered me more than the light itself. I checked my watch out of habit, 10:17 p.m. I took a step closer to the railing, squinting, trying to get a better sense of distance. The light didn't flicker, didn't drift, didn't pulse. It just stayed exactly where it was, like it had been pinned there. At 10:19, it vanished. Not faded. Not dropped behind the trees. It shut off, clean and instant, like someone flipped a switch. I stood there for a while longer, waiting to see if it would come back. It didn't. Eventually, the mosquitoes won, and I went inside. I didn't think much about it until the next night. Same time, same deck, same lake. I was brushing my teeth at the sink, looking out the window when the light appeared again in the exact same spot. Same brightness, same height above the trees. I spat toothpaste into the sink and leaned closer to the glass. Again, no reflection on the water. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, hoping to get a picture. As soon as I raised the camera, I hesitated. The screen made it harder to judge distance, and I didn't want to miss whatever was happening. I checked the time instead. 10:17 p.m. My skin prickled. That's when I realized I'd been subconsciously waiting for it. At 10:19, it vanished. That night, I slept badly. Not because I was scared exactly, more because my brain wouldn't let it go. It kept cycling through explanations. Drone, aircraft, someone across the lake messing with a spotlight, and rejecting all of them. On the third night, I brought a chair down to the shoreline. I sat there with my feet in the sand, lake lapping softly a few inches away. Frogs croaked somewhere off to my right. The air was cool enough that I wore a hoodie. 10:15 came and went. At 10:17, the light appeared. Seeing it from closer to the water made it worse. The lack of reflection was undeniable now. The lake looked like a sheet of black glass, untouched by that bright point above it. I moved my head side to side, checking angles. Nothing changed. I waved my hand in front of my face, feeling stupid, half expecting the light to respond. It didn't. I felt strangely aware of my own breathing, the sound of it loud in my ears. The rest of the night felt muted, like the lake was absorbing sound instead of carrying it. At 10:19, the light shut off. The darkness that replaced it felt heavier than before. On the fourth day, I drove into the nearest town to restock groceries. At the small bait shop by the gas station, I casually mentioned the light to the guy behind the counter. "Hey," I said, trying to sound relaxed. "You ever notice a bright light over the lake at night? Around 10?" He frowned. "Which lake?" I told him. He shook his head. "Not that I've heard." That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. That evening, clouds rolled in just before sunset, thick, low, gray ones that blotted out the stars completely. I almost convinced myself the light wouldn't appear. It did. Same spot, same brightness, hanging just below the cloud layer like the clouds had parted around it. Still no reflection. The frogs had gone silent. I became aware of a faint pressure in my ears, like the start of altitude sickness. It wasn't painful, just noticeable. 10:19. Gone. That night, I dreamed of the lake drained dry, the bottom exposed and smooth with something bright hovering just above the empty basin. I woke up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing and the sense that I'd missed something important. On the fifth night, I set an alarm for 10:10. I wanted to be ready. I wanted to see if anything changed. I stood at the edge of the dock this time, toes hanging over the water. The lake smelled different at night, metallic and cold. The light appeared right on time. As I watched it, I realized something else was wrong. The trees beneath it didn't move. Everywhere else around the lake, branches swayed slightly in the breeze. Leaves rustled. But directly below the light, the tree line was perfectly still, like a photograph. I swallowed hard. The pressure in my ears deepened. I felt it in my chest too, a faint vibration, low and steady, like a distant engine idling. I checked my watch. 10:18. For the first time all week, the light changed. It didn't move, but it seemed to grow slightly brighter, not enough to hurt my eyes, just enough that I could feel it, like standing near a warm bulb. I took a step back without meaning to. At exactly 10:19, the light vanished, and the vibration stopped at the same instant. The night rushed back in. Frogs started croaking again, loud and frantic. The breeze returned to the trees beneath where the light had been. I stood there shaking, arms wrapped around myself, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The sixth night, I didn't go outside. I watched from the window instead. Lights off inside the cabin. I felt foolish and tense, like I was hiding from something that didn't know I existed. 10:17. The light appeared. Even through the glass, I could tell there was still no reflection on the lake. I noticed something new then. My reflection in the window looked slightly delayed, like my movements lagged by a fraction of a second. I stepped back from the glass, heart pounding. 10:19. Gone. That was the night I decided to leave early. I packed up the next morning, telling myself I'd just cut the trip short. No big deal. Still, as I loaded the car, I kept glancing at the far shore of the lake, half expecting to see the light even in daylight. On the seventh night I was driving home. I stopped at a small roadside motel about an hour away from the cabin. I didn't want to push the drive too late. At 10:16, I stood in the parking lot, keys in hand, staring west. The lake was miles away. At 10:17, a bright white light appeared above the tree line in the distance. Same height, same intensity. I felt the pressure in my ears instantly. I checked my watch, my pulse hammering. At 10:19, it vanished. I stood there in the dark parking lot, breathing hard, surrounded by the quiet hum of highway traffic, knowing with a certainty that made my stomach drop that the light hadn't been tied to the lake at all. It had been tied to me. I drove the rest of the way home that night without stopping. I don't go near that cabin anymore. I don't go near lakes at night if I can help it. Sometimes, though, when I glance at the clock and see it's 10:17, I get the urge to look up, just to make sure the sky above me still feels empty. I was sitting on my porch with a cup of mint tea, watching the last scraps of twilight fade over the hills west of the house. It was early September, one of those evenings in rural Vermont where the heat from the day finally gives up and the woods start cooling fast. The crickets were loud, the air smelled like cut grass, and the sky still held a faint band of blue before it dropped into full darkness. My house sits on a slope above the road, facing a rolling hill that's half forest and half old pasture. I'd lived there 3 years by then, long enough to know every usual sound: trucks shifting on the downhill, foxes screeching in the woods, the neighbors' wind chimes. It was a quiet night. Too quiet, maybe, but I didn't think anything of it. I had just leaned back in the rocker and pulled a blanket across my legs when I saw the first sign of it, a faint white glow appearing behind the crest of the hill. At first I thought it was the moon, except the moon wasn't supposed to rise on that side, and this glow was small, tight, not spreading. It looked like a single point of light, too white to be headlights, too steady to be a house lamp. It was far away, maybe half a mile, and low to the ground. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The glow brightened slightly, like something rising slowly up the ridge from the far side. I waited for the shape of a car to follow, or for the glow to break into familiar beams as it came over the hill. But the light stayed round, compact, and lifted higher, smoothly, like it was being pushed up through thick fog, even though the air was clear. That was what made me sit forward. The motion didn't feel mechanical. It didn't bounce like off-road headlights. It didn't wobble like a drone. It just rose, calm and weirdly confident. By the time it crested fully above the hill, the glow was about the size of a softball held at arm's length. A clean white, not glaring, with no halo around it. Just a sphere of light suspended about 10 or 15 feet above the ridge. I felt this strange urge to stand, like staying seated was the wrong thing to do. Not from fear, more like instinct telling me to shift into some kind of alertness. I set the tea down, pushed the blanket aside, and stood up. As soon as I did, the glow shifted. Not backing away, not darting off. It simply paused for half a second, like acknowledging the movement, before slipping straight down behind the ridge, disappearing in the same smooth, controlled motion it had come up with. Gone. No fade out, no flicker. Just gone. The tree line swallowed the darkness again, and the hill looked normal, just a quiet ridge at dusk with the first stars starting to appear overhead. I stayed on my feet a while, staring at the place where the light had peaked above the hill. My eyes kept scanning the edges of the trees, waiting for the glow to come up again. Nothing did. I checked the time on my phone. Only a few minutes had passed, but it felt longer, like something had stretched time in a subtle way I couldn't prove. When I sat back down, the cricket started up again, but softer. Sparse. Like they were testing the air first. I tried to relax, But every few seconds I'd glance back at that ridge. The glow had been too deliberate, too smooth. Lights don't move like that unless someone or something is controlling them. I waited maybe 15 minutes before giving up and going inside to grab a jacket. When I stepped back out, the air felt colder than it should have, like the temperature had dropped faster on my property than anywhere else. I pulled the jacket tight and scanned the hill again. Then I noticed something new. The clouds overhead, thin, harmless streaks, were drifting normally east. But above the hill, directly where the light had appeared, the clouds changed speed, only in that one patch. They slowed visibly for a moment, like they passed through a layer of air that was thicker or warmer or something different. Then they sped up again, rejoining the normal flow. I'd never seen clouds behave like that. I walked down the steps into the yard, just far enough to get a clearer angle on the ridge. The grass was damp, the smell strong. Everything else felt too still. Even the road below was empty. "Hello?" I said into the dark without meaning to. My voice landed wrong, flat, swallowed fast like the sound didn't carry past a certain point. I shut my mouth and backed up the steps. Around 9:30, a car finally passed on the road, Jacob's old pickup, the engine rattling like always. I watched his taillights disappear. Just seeing another human that close made me feel more grounded, though I had nothing to say to him even if he'd stopped. When the glow didn't return, I tried going inside to distract myself. Tried watching TV, tried sorting some mail, but my eyes kept drifting to the porch window. The ridge sat there in perfect silhouette, unmoving, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was supposed to watch it, like missing something would be worse than seeing it. Around 10:15, I stepped back outside. The temperature had dropped again, not dramatically, but enough that I could see my breath faintly. The sky was darker, with thicker clouds forming overhead. The crickets were almost silent now. I listened hard, hearing nothing but wind in the birch trees on the far end of the property. Then the glow appeared again. Not above the ridge this time, through it. A faint white radiance bled upward between two tall pines, as if the source of the light was below the crest, but brighter than before. The glow rose slowly, slicing a thin shape between the tree trunks. But instead of lifting all the way into view, it stopped halfway, hesitated, and slipped back down. My heartbeat thudded painfully in my ears. I stepped backward toward the house. One foot hit the porch step. I didn't take my eyes off the ridge. The glow came up a second time. Slower, more deliberate, and again, it paused just before revealing itself. This time it hovered for several seconds. Not visible directly, only as a pale outline against the trees, but I could feel its presence. Not physically, but in that strange way you sense someone's attention before they speak. Like the air was leaning toward me. I raised a hand slightly, as if shielding my eyes from something brighter. The glow slipped back down one last time and didn't reappear. I stood there waiting long after it faded. My legs grew stiff, my hands numb. The ridge looked normal. The clouds resumed their usual drifting. Eventually the crickets started chirping again, evenly this time. I went inside, but didn't lock the door right away. My mind kept replaying the exact motion of that glow, how it rose, paused, and retreated with such controlled smoothness, like it wasn't moving randomly, but reacting somehow. Before going to bed, I checked the hill through the upstairs window. Nothing. The ridge looked empty, just dark trees against darker sky. But when I finally pulled the curtains closed, I hesitated. For a second, less than that, I thought I saw a faint white reflection move across the glass. Too quick to be from a car, too high to be from anything in the yard. I stood there, hand on the curtain, staring at nothing. My chest tightened until I remembered to breathe. I never saw the glow again after that night. But every time I sit on the porch now, especially near dusk, my eyes always drift first to that ridge, waiting for a small, deliberate light to lift into view, hover long enough for me to rise to my feet, and then slip silently back down behind the hill as if it had been watching me watch it. I was night fishing on Lake Mendota, something I'd started doing after work when my schedule got weird and I couldn't sleep until late anyway. It was early June, warm but not sticky, with a thin layer of fog hovering over the water. Not enough to hide anything, just enough to make the horizon blur. The lake wasn't busy that night. One pontoon way out near Governor's Island, a kayak closer to shore, and me sitting on the old wooden dock behind the park. It was about 11:40 p.m. I remember that because I kept checking the time, debating whether I should pack it up soon before the humidity really kicked in. My lantern was dimmed low to avoid spooking fish, and the only sounds were gentle water laps and the occasional plunk of a carp somewhere in the dark. I was retying a knot when I noticed the light. A thin, perfectly straight line of white sliding across the lake's surface. At first I thought it was a reflection. Maybe headlights from the road behind me hitting the water through a gap in the trees. But cars had passed earlier, and their reflections had always been broken, jittery. Nothing like this. This light was clean, sharp. It moved in a slow, steady sweep, cutting right across the faint fog sitting on the water. I froze with the line in my hands. The beam was so thin it looked like someone had drawn on the lake with a white pencil. It stretched maybe 30 or 40 feet and moved as if coming from a high-angle spotlight. Except when I looked up, the sky was empty. No planes, no drones, just a dark, hazy expanse with scattered stars. I stood up. The line of light continued sliding, perfectly horizontal, as if scanning the water. When it reached a patch of reeds near the shore, it didn't bend or waver, just passed cleanly over them as the reeds weren't even there. My breath caught in my throat. There was no sound. Not from the water, not from the trees, even the insects had gone quiet. I slowly turned my head to look for any source. Someone on the dock, someone on the far shore, a boat with a floodlight. Nothing. The pontoon I'd seen earlier was gone. The kayak had paddled off without me noticing. I was the only person left. The line of light stopped moving. It held still on the surface about 20 yards out. I could see the tiny ripples of the lake distorting it, but the line itself didn't break, which didn't make sense. Light doesn't stay that perfectly straight when water moves underneath it. I took one step closer to the edge of the dock. The light reacted. It shrank, like it contracted into itself, becoming shorter but brighter. Not by much, but enough that I felt it more than saw it. A sudden alertness, like someone focusing their attention. I stayed completely still. For several seconds, nothing moved. The lake felt held in place, like suspended. The fog drifted around everything except that line of light, like it avoided getting too close. Then the line expanded again, slowly, stretching back to its previous length, and it began sliding the other direction. Not fast, not jerky, just smooth, deliberate, like it was searching for something. I watched it move all the way to the far end of the dock, where it paused again. The water lapped softly against the wood, but even those sounds seemed muted. Then I noticed something else. My fishing line, which had been dangling motionless in the water, was vibrating gently. Not from fish, not from wind, just a steady tremor that traveled up the rod and into my hand, and into my hand. I reeled in quickly, not wanting anything touching the water near wherever that light was. The vibrating stopped once the line cleared the surface. But the moment I set the rod down, the light contracted again, brightening for a second time. It wasn't reacting to sound. It wasn't reacting to movement on the water. It was reacting to me. I backed up to the midpoint of the dock, heart pounding. The planks creaked under my weight, and the sound echoed strangely across the lake, like the fog muffled it unevenly. The light expanded once more, stretching wide, then faded slightly, not disappearing, but dimming to a barely visible outline. I held my breath. The light brightened again, sharper than before, and then, without warning, it vanished. 1 second it was there, sliding over the water, and the next the surface was completely dark, only the faint reflection of my lantern marking where the dock met the lake. The silence that followed felt wrong, heavy, expectant. I waited for the line to reappear. Nothing. I turned slowly, scanning the sky again. Still no planes, no distant spotlights, no search beams. Just a still, clouded night that hadn't changed at all. I picked up my lantern and held it out toward the water, half expecting the light to reveal something just under the surface. The lake stared back, black and calm. That's when a small splash sounded off to my left. Not a natural one, not a fish. It was too clean, too centered, like an object had dropped into the water with intent. I swung the lantern toward the sound, lighting up only fog and ripples. Another splash came from behind me, then one from farther out. Not rapid, not chaotic, just sporadic drops, like pebbles falling from nowhere. I stood perfectly still, my fingers tightening around the lantern handle. The splashes continued for maybe 15 seconds, then stopped all at once, and then the entire forest seemed to inhale and go silent again. I packed up without bothering to coil my line properly. Every sound I made felt wrong, too loud, or too sharp, or out of place. Even the metal clasp on my tackle box clicked like it was being amplified. As I was about to step off the dock, I hesitated and looked back one more time. For a split second, less than a blink, I saw a faint line of light flicker across the water again. Not sweeping, not moving, just appearing like a ghost of the first one. Then it disappeared completely, leaving the lake as black as ink. I practically jogged back to my car, though it felt like the world was stuck a half second behind me. The fog thickened near the tree line, swallowing the shapes of the picnic tables and trash bins. When I reached the gravel lot, my headlights reflected off something on the water, a short, sharp gleam, before fading. I drove home with the radio off, checking the rearview mirror every few minutes, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to see anything through the fog. When I finally got home and stepped inside, the silence in my living room felt too similar to the silence at the lake, like it had followed me. The next morning, I went back to the dock out of stubbornness. The lake looked normal. Kids were fishing, boats were out, the fog was gone. There was nothing unusual on the water. No light, no splashes, no silence that felt like pressure. But once when the sun hit the surface just right, I thought I saw a thin white line gliding across the water toward the reeds. It vanished before I could be sure I hadn't imagined it. My smartwatch vibrated for the third time before I even made it to the end of my street. At first, I assumed it was just some glitch. Maybe I'd forgotten to clear a notification or the haptics were acting up again. It had done weird things before after getting splashed during a run, so didn't think much of it. But when I lifted my wrist, the screen was blank. No messages, no reminders, no health alerts, just the time glowing at me like nothing was wrong. I shook my wrist a little and kept walking. The vibration stopped for about 10 seconds. Then it buzzed again. 2 short taps against my skin, the exact pattern it used for incoming texts. I sighed and muttered to myself, "Come on, don't die on me now," and raised my wrist again. Still nothing on the display. It was just after 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, dry, cool, early fall. I was walking back from my friend Andrea's place a few blocks over. She'd asked me to help her move a bookshelf down a flight of stairs, which turned into helping her rearrange half her living room. I was tired, and I just wanted to get home, microwave leftover pasta, and zone out in front of a show. My neighborhood was quiet, suburban, but older. Large maple trees, uneven sidewalks, houses set back behind hedges and low fences. A few porch lights were on, but most places were dark. The sky was clear, except for a thin scatter of clouds drifting toward the horizon. Good visibility. The kind of night when you could see every star that wasn't drowned out by street lamps. My watch buzzed again. Harder this time. Longer vibration, like an alarm. I stopped under a corner streetlight and swiped the screen. Nothing. I held down the button to check for system errors. Still nothing. The watch was acting like it was perfectly normal, but also like it was desperately trying to get my attention. That was the first moment I felt uneasy. The second happened a few seconds later when I noticed the speck of light above the street. I don't know how long it had been there before I noticed it. It wasn't bright, not like a plane or a drone or even a satellite, just a faint, dim point, no bigger than a star. But it was low, much too low to be anything astronomical. My first thought was that it was the tip of a radio tower, but there were no towers anywhere near that part of town, and it was sitting perfectly still above the intersection ahead of me, not blinking, not moving, just hanging there. My watch buzzed twice. I looked from the watch to the light, from the light back to the watch. My heartbeat picked up in this uncomfortable, crawling way. I couldn't shake the feeling the two things were connected. Not in any logical sense, but in the way you just know something's wrong before you have proof. I took a few slow steps forward. The light didn't shift. It didn't flicker. It didn't react at all. But my watch buzzed again. 3 sharp pulses. Not any pattern I recognized. I turned in a slow circle, checking for headlights, security lights, electrical transformers, anything that might be throwing some kind of reflection. There was nothing unusual. Just empty street, evenly spaced lamps, silent houses. No movement except the slight rustling of leaves overhead. I thought about calling Andrea, but I felt silly. What would I even say? Hey, my watch is spazzing out and there's a dot in the sky? No way. Instead, I kept walking. Every few seconds, my watch vibrated. Some pulses were short, some long, some felt almost hesitant. It reminded me of someone tapping their finger on a desk while deciding whether to speak. When I reached the intersection, the speck of light hung right above the four-way stop. Maybe 100 feet up, maybe less. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate anything below it. The pavement looked exactly as it always did, smooth patches, cracked patches, a faded crosswalk symbol. Nothing unusual. But the light looked close, closer than any star had a right to be. My watch buzzed so hard it startled me. I flinched and almost dropped my arm. This time, when I checked the screen, it was glowing white. Just a blank white screen, no icons, no numbers, no backlight bleed, perfectly uniform. I tapped it, swiped, held the button, nothing changed. And the light above me dimmed. Not all at once, more like a slow fade as if someone was turning a knob. I stepped back instinctively, expecting it to blink out or drop lower or reveal some shape around it. Instead, it hovered there, barely visible, then brightened again, back to its original faint glow. My throat tightened. I realized I'd been holding my breath. I forced myself to look away from the light and check around the intersection again. No cars, no people, not even a stray cat or cyclist. Just a quiet residential street and that point of dim illumination hanging above it. My watch buzzed in one long, continuous vibration. I lifted it toward my face and the buzzing stopped instantly. The screen stayed white. Then very slowly it faded back to the regular time display. 9:14 p.m. Like nothing had happened. I didn't move for a long moment. Just listened. Waited. My watch stayed quiet. I forced myself to walk. Not fast, but steady. One foot after the other. I kept my peripheral vision locked on the light, trying not to look directly at it, but needing to know if it moved. It stayed overhead. I rounded the corner onto my street. The light drifted slightly, not downward, not sideways exactly, more like it repositioned itself to stay aligned with me. The movement was so smooth I almost doubted I saw it, like a trick of my eyes. My watch buzzed once. Short, sharp. I broke into a faster walk. Halfway down my block, the light finally moved. It rose, straight upward. Not fast, just steadily climbing through the air. The higher it got, the dimmer it looked, until it was impossible to tell whether it had disappeared or simply blended in with the stars. By the time I reached my driveway, it was gone. My watch didn't vibrate again for the rest of the night. Inside my house, I sat on the couch with the watch off my wrist, set on the coffee table like it might do something if I looked away. It didn't. It stayed on, functioning normally. I restarted it twice, no glitches, no phantom notifications. Later, when I lay in bed, I replayed the walk over and over, trying to rationalize the whole thing. Maybe it really was a drone, one with a very weak light and a completely silent motor, or a satellite caught at a strange angle, or some atmospheric trick, and the buzzing was a coincidence or an electrical issue. Those explanations should have made me feel better. They didn't, because sometimes when I'm halfway to work or the grocery store or Andrea's house, the watch gives one single, unprompted buzz. Just one. And every instinct I have makes me check the sky. I was somewhere between Wausian and Napoleon when the radio went dead. 1 second, it was some late-night call-in show out of Toledo, the host talking over a guy from Bowling Green about gas prices, and the next, it was just gone. No static, no fade-out. Just a flat, empty silence that didn't even sound like the normal quiet between stations. I glanced down at the display. The station number was still there, the volume bar still halfway up. I nudged the knob anyway. Nothing changed. Great, I muttered, more to fill the space than anything else. It was close to midnight. Late July. Northern Ohio. The kind of humid summer night where the air feels thick even with the windows up and the AC on low. I was on County Road 13, the back way to my parents' place, because I'd left my buddy Nate's house too late and wanted to avoid the highway patrol. The world outside the headlights was just corn and soybeans and the occasional dark shape of a barn. No towns for a few miles, no gas stations, no other cars either. The last pair of headlights I'd seen had been 10 minutes earlier, coming the opposite direction. I tapped the radio off and back on. Still nothing, not even static when I spun the dial. Instead, a faint tone began. It came in underneath the dead silence like somebody had slid a tiny tuning fork inside the speakers. One soft, pure note. Not high enough to be painful, not low enough to feel like a vibration. Just a thin, clean tone that pulsed in a slow rhythm. On, off, off. I checked the display again. No station name, just FM 97.3 frozen there. When I twisted the knob to change it, the numbers moved, but the tones stayed. Same volume, same pattern, completely unaffected. The hair on the back of my neck stirred. I told myself it was some weird capacitor issue or a loose wire screwing with the audio. I'd bought the car used. The stereo already had quirks. Still, the timing of it felt strange. The tone pulsed at almost exactly the same tempo as my heartbeat. I tested it, held my fingers to my wrist, counting silently. 1 pulse, 2, 3. The tone lined up for several beats, then drifted slightly, then lined up again. Not perfect, but close enough that I noticed. I turned the radio off entirely. The tone kept going. That's when my stomach finally flipped. The display went completely black, as if it had lost power, and the rest of the dash dimmed for half a second before returning to normal. Check engine lights stayed off, RPM steady, temperature fine. Everything looked normal except for the dark radio screen and that thin, rhythmic tone still coming from the speakers. I cracked the window to see if the sound was actually in my head. Warm, damp air pushed in, carrying the smell of manure and cut grass. Crickets droned faintly in the distance. No tone. When I rolled the window back up, I heard it again. Clear as before. On, off. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter and focused on the road. The cornfields on either side loomed high, taller than the car, blocking out any view of farmhouses beyond them. Every so often, I'd pass a break in the rows where a dirt lane cut through. Each time, my headlights would briefly wash over a mailbox or a metal gate before the corn walls closed in again. A few minutes went by like that. Just the hum of the engine and that soft, unnatural beeping in my ears. Then the tone changed. It doubled in speed, still soft, but the pulses now closer together. My chest tightened. It felt like someone had turned a dial inside my head. At the exact same moment, the fields opened up. I came to a long stretch where the land dipped away from the road into a broad, flat expanse planted with soy. The plants were low enough that I could see all the way across the field to the tree line and the old power lines that marched along the horizon like sharp black stitches. And there, ahead and slightly to the right, hovering over the field, was a dull red light. I saw it first as a smudge above the soybeans, like the end of a cigarette held in the dark. Then, as I got closer and the angle changed, it sharpened into a solid shape. Not perfectly round, not a point like a star, but more like the fuzzy circle you see when you stare at an LED through frosted glass. It hung maybe 20 or 30 feet above the ground, motionless. No blinking, no strobing, no beam, just a steady, muted red that didn't spill onto anything below it. I eased off the gas without realizing it. My speed dropped from 55 to 40, then to 35. The car felt too fast no matter what I did. My focus tunneled onto that light. The tone in the speakers shifted again, lowering in pitch slightly, still rhythmic, still detached from anything I did. I reached for my phone in the cup holder. The screen refused to turn on. The haptic buzz came through under my thumb, but the display stayed black like the backlight had died. No glow, no icons, nothing. I held the power button. Nothing changed. "Come on," I whispered. The red light grew larger in the windshield as I approached. It stayed the same color, the same intensity. Dirt lanes branched off on both sides, empty and dark. No parked trucks, no yard lights, no signs of a farmhouse connected to that field. When I drew nearly parallel with the light, I realized how wrong it was. There was no reflection. The soybeans underneath it were just dark shapes in the wash of my headlights. The light didn't touch them at all. It didn't touch the road either. It was as if the air around it was the only thing allowed to participate. My instincts started screaming at me, but my body lagged behind, caught between wanting to slow down and wanting to floor it. I ended up settling somewhere in the middle, creeping past at maybe 20 miles an hour, eyes locked on the side window now. The red light remained exactly where it was, perfectly still, hovering over the field about 50 yards out. The tone in the speakers grew more insistent, not louder, just more present, like it was pressing against the inside of my ears. On, off, on, off, on, off. I could hear my own breathing now over the sound of the tires on asphalt. It sounded too loud in the small car. For 1 second, everything lined up. The car moving slowly forward, the empty road, the shadowy field, and that unnatural flat red glow hanging in the middle of it all. Then it shot upward, no ramp up, no acceleration, just instantaneous motion like someone had cut a frame out of reality. One moment it was there over the field, the next it was a streak zipping straight into the sky. A vertical smear of red, thin and impossibly fast, disappearing into the low clouds without ever bending or curving. The clouds themselves lit faintly from within, where the streak vanished. The glow spread out in a soft circle, then shrank back to normal gray. The tone cut out mid-pulse. Silence slammed into the car. Real silence, with only the engine and the faint hiss of tires left. My ears rang with the absence of that sound. I realized my foot had lifted fully off the gas. The car was coasting. I forced myself to look away from the rearview mirror where I'd been expecting to still see some trace of red. There was nothing. Just the empty road behind and the dark smear of field. I pressed the accelerator and watched the speedometer climb. 30, 40, 50. Off to my right, the brittle silhouettes of corn stalks rose again as the fields changed back from soy to tall crops. The tunnel closed in around me. For a few miles, I didn't dare glance at the sky. Eventually, curiosity or stupidity won out. I flicked my eyes upward through the windshield. The clouds looked ordinary. No glowing shapes. No strange holes. No streaks. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I grabbed it so fast, I almost dropped it. The screen lit up normally, full brightness, icons all where they should be. A flood of delayed notifications came in. Group chat, email, a weather alert about possible fog after midnight. I opened the compass app without really knowing why. The little arrow spun twice, then settled. North was north again. I turned the radio back on. It came to life at normal volume, the call-in host droning about city council drama like nothing had happened. I spun the dial. Every station I hit was exactly where it should be, with normal static between them. I kept going until I reached the highway. When I pulled into my parents' driveway half an hour later, the porch light was on and the house looked exactly as it had for the past 20 years. My mom's ceramic rooster still sat lopsided on the front step. The maple tree still leaned slightly over the garage. Nothing felt any different out there. The sky was just sky. Inside, my dad was half asleep in his recliner with some late-night news show murmuring in the background. He glanced at the clock and asked if the drive had been okay. I heard myself say, "Yeah, fine," like I'd rehearsed it. It wasn't until I was alone in the guest room that I checked the time on my phone again. 12:07 a.m. The dashboard clock in my car had said 11:58 when I pulled into the driveway. I know because I looked, surprised I made it before midnight. 9 minutes difference. My car clock had always been dead on. I checked it compulsively against my phone on longer drives. Maybe it had just drifted. Maybe I'd misread it. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of a passing train. Every time headlights swept the guest room curtains, my heart lurched, waiting to see a dull red instead of the normal white and yellow. Nothing strange happened the rest of the night. But a few weeks later, driving home along a different stretch of county road at dusk, the radio flickered. Just once. Just enough for one soft, familiar tone to slip through between songs. A single pulse, so faint I could almost pretend I'd imagined it. Then everything went back to normal and the sky above the fields stayed empty. I found the warm rock about 2 hours into the hike. It was late October in northern New Mexico up in the Sangre de Cristos. I'd started from the ski basin trailhead around noon, planning to make it to a little overlook I liked, and back down before dark. The weather had been clear when I parked. Bright sun, cold air, that thin, dry wind you only get at altitude. There were a few cars at the trailhead, but by the time I passed the first mile marker, I hadn't seen anyone for a while. The higher I climbed, the colder it got. Patches of old snow clung to the shaded side of the trail, and my breath came out in white puffs. The sun went behind some thin clouds, and the temperature dropped another few degrees. My fingers stung where they stuck out of my gloves. I remember thinking I should have brought a thicker hat. I was blowing into my hands and flexing them when my boot hit a patch of bare rock that felt wrong. Imagine stepping from cold tile to a heated floor. That quick little shock. That's what it felt like, except it was a chunk of granite wedged into the trail at 10,000 feet with frost around its edges. I stopped and stepped back, then forward again to make sure I hadn't imagined it. Same thing. The rock, about 3 feet long and maybe 2 feet wide, was warm. Not hot enough to burn, just like it had been sitting in direct sun on a summer day instead of in the shade of a cluster of pines. I looked up, half expecting a shaft of sunlight to be hitting it through the branches, but the canopy above that stretch was solid. No direct sun. Everything else around was crusted with thin ice. Melted snow had refrozen in little glassy patches off to the side. I squatted down and pressed my gloved hand flat to the rock, warm even through the glove. I pulled the glove off and touched it with my bare fingers. Definitely warm. Not steaming, not glowing, just wrong for where it was. A little uncomfortable feeling slid down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the rock had some kind of mineral that held heat better, or maybe water running under it was warmer. I didn't know. I'm not a geologist. But the air around it was cold, and my knees were starting to ache from crouching there. I stood up and took a step back to get a better look at the whole section. That's when I noticed the sky. Directly above that stretch of trail, through a gap in the branches, the sky looked warped. It was subtle. If I hadn't been staring straight up, I might not have seen it at all. But there was this faint shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt in the summer. The blue behind it wobbled, bending slightly. There was no jet, no contrail, nothing that should have caused it. I moved a couple of steps to the left. The shimmer stayed over that same patch of trail. I moved to the right, same thing. I walked forward, past the warm rock, and looked up again. The distortion was behind me now, parked over the place I'd just been standing. The wind died down, not completely, but enough that the trees around me stopped creaking. It was suddenly very quiet. No birds, no distant road noise, no other hikers. I could hear my own breathing and the faint rush of blood in my ears. I stepped back onto the warm rock. The air around my legs got maybe a degree or two warmer. Not by much, but enough to notice. The hair on my arms lifted under my jacket like static was building. My phone buzzed in my pocket, which made me jump. I pulled it out. No notification, no call. The screen showed the time, 2:08 p.m., and the battery icon flickered from 68% down to 52%, held there, then slowly crawled back up to 64%. The GPS icon flashed once and then disappeared, even though I had airplane mode on. I backed off the rock again. As soon as my boots hit dirt, the air felt normal cold. The static sensation vanished. The phone screen stabilized at 63%, like nothing had happened. I laughed a little under my breath, a short, nervous sound, and told myself I was imagining it. High altitude, low blood sugar, whatever. I took a drink of water, ate half a granola bar, and decided to keep going. It was weird, but I didn't have a better explanation, and standing there, staring at a piece of stone, wasn't going to change anything. As I walked away, I checked over my shoulder a few times. The rock looked like any other rock. The sky above it still had that slight ripple, but as the trail curved, branches blocked my view, and eventually I lost sight of it. About 10 minutes later, something else felt off. It took me a while to figure out what. I kept walking, expecting to meet the switchback that always told me I was halfway to the overlook. It never came. The trail only had so much variation, and I knew it pretty well. But the turns and rises weren't matching my memory. I stopped and pulled out my phone again to check the trail map I'd downloaded. The arrow showing my position spun in a slow circle, then snapped to a spot about 50 yards to the left of the trail line, as if I were walking in the woods off path. I rotated in place, watching it twitch. It wouldn't settle. I turned airplane mode off just long enough to see if GPS would behave better. No signal bars popped up, but the arrow jumped again, this time a quarter-mile ahead, near a junction I definitely hadn't reached. The map stuttered, then froze. The timestamp at the top of the screen read 2:48 p.m. I checked my watch. 2:31 p.m. I held them side by side. The watch ticked over to 2:32 while the phone stayed at 2:48, then suddenly updated all at once to 2:32 like it was correcting itself. That tight feeling in my chest came back. I stuffed the phone in my pocket, told myself I was just being jumpy, and kept walking. I paid extra attention to the trail markers this time, reading the carved numbers out loud to keep myself grounded. The wind came back, but only in short gusts, like someone was breathing on the trees instead of a steady breeze moving through. A couple of times it pushed hard enough to sway the pines, then cut out completely, leaving the branches settling and creaking in a way that didn't match the air. When I finally reached the overlook, the view was normal. Valley stretching out below, distant highway, a few scattered houses. The sun was dropping toward a bank of clouds, painting everything pale gold. For a few minutes, I felt stupid for freaking myself out, and I took a couple of pictures, ate the rest of the granola bar, and decided to head back down before the light got weird. Going down, I tried not to think about the rock, but my mind kept circling back to it. I timed my pace with my watch out of curiosity. It usually took me about 35 minutes to get back to that spot. At 27 minutes, I started looking for landmarks. The crooked pine with the lightning scar, the big boulder that looked like a face. They came and went in order, just like normal. But when I reached the point where I knew the warm rock had to be, the trail looked different. The pines thinned out a bit, and a patch of exposed stone spread across the path where I didn't remember there being so much bare rock. It wasn't just one stone now. It was a slab, maybe 10 feet long and 4 wide, slightly raised from the surrounding ground. Frost edged it in a clean line. I slowed down and reached my hand out. Warm, not hot, but warmer than my skin. The same even warmth as before, just over a bigger area. I stepped onto it and stopped. The world dulled. The sound of the wind faded like someone turned the volume down. My breathing sounded farther away from me, if that makes any sense. The trees at the edge of my vision seemed to bend inward a fraction, like I was looking through a wide-angle lens. I looked up through the gap in the branches. The distortion in the sky was bigger now. It wasn't just a shimmer. It was a column, like a vertical river of slightly bent air rising up from the rock. The clouds behind it warped as they moved past, stretching thin, then snapping back to shape once they cleared the area. There was no color change, no light, just that wavering vertical strip. Standing on the rock, I felt a faint vibration through my boots, like a truck idling far underground. It wasn't strong enough to shake dust loose or anything. It was just there at the edge of sensation. I don't know how long I stood there. 10 seconds? A minute? Time felt slippery. My phone buzzed again, a quick triple vibration like a notification coming in. I pulled it out, screen black, pressed the side button. Nothing happened for a moment, then it lit up, battery at 19%, even though it had been in the 60s earlier. The time said 4:11 p.m. My watch said 3:03. My throat went dry. I stepped off the stone. The moment my foot hit dirt, the vibration vanished. The sound of the wind returned full force, making me flinch. I looked up. The column of distortion was still there, but thinner, like whatever was causing it had pulled back slightly. I backed away fast, eyes locked on that shimmer. It didn't move toward me. It didn't do anything dramatic. It just hung there, rippling gently, as if heat were rising from the rock in a place that was too cold for heat to be doing that. By the time I rounded the next bend and trees blocked my view, my heart was pounding hard enough to make me lightheaded. I almost ran the rest of the way down. Every now and then I'd feel a brief wave of warmth against my legs, like walking through a sunbeam inside a mostly shaded forest. It wouldn't last. Just brush past. But it always made me check the sky. Once, maybe 10 minutes after I'd left the rock behind, the trees opened up and I could see the ridgeline above where I knew the slab was. The sky over that part of the mountain still had that faint vertical wobble to it, even from a distance. Not a cloud, not smoke, just a patch of air that looked wrong. I focused on the trail and forced myself to keep moving. The light was changing fast now, going from gold to that flat gray that comes right before dusk. Temperatures dropped again. My fingers went numb even inside my gloves. The last half mile to the trailhead felt longer than the whole hike up. When I finally saw the parking lot through the trees, a kind of weak relief hit me. There were only 2 cars left, mine and an old blue Tacoma. I didn't see anyone around, but there was a faint scratching sound coming from the Tacoma's bed, like something shifting in a plastic bin. I didn't investigate. I shoved my pack in the backseat of my car and got in, leaving the engine off for a second to just sit. The forest was quiet. No birds, no voices. Even the wind seemed to have faded. I started the car. The radio came on automatically, mid-song. I reached to turn it down, but right as my fingers hit the knob, all the sound cut out. The display went blank for a second, then lit back up with a full volume bar and no station info, like it had reset itself. A high, almost inaudible tone hummed through the speakers, there and not there, like my ears were making it up. I turned the radio off completely. The hum stopped. The dashboard clock read 4:38 p.m. My watch said 3:29. I looked back and forth between them, then at my phone, which had died somewhere in the last 10 minutes. Black screen, no response when I held the button. That was enough. I pulled out of the lot and drove down the mountain, hands tight on the wheel. So as I descended, the normal world seeped back in. I passed a couple in hiking gear walking along the shoulder, their dog trotting ahead. A truck came around a bend going the opposite way, headlights on. A crow flew low across the road in front of my windshield. By the time I hit cell range again, the car clock had synced with the time on my phone after it rebooted. They both agreed it was a little after 5. My watch still insisted it wasn't even 4 yet. I didn't go back to sync them that night. I left the watch on the counter and let it be wrong until the battery ran out weeks later. I've been up that trail since then, but only in summer and only with other people. We've never found that exact section of warm rock again. There's bare stone in a few places that might be it, but it's always cold when we touch it, even in August. Still, sometimes when we stop for water, I catch myself staring at the sky through the gaps in the branches, waiting to see that slight, impossible shimmer, bending the air, where the mountain should just be mountain and nothing else. I first heard the humming around 11:20 p.m., a low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I was sitting on my couch scrolling through messages, half watching a documentary I'd already seen twice. At first, I thought it was an appliance, maybe the fridge kicking on, but it wasn't mechanical. It was softer, steadier, a kind of rhythmic hum, rising and falling so gradually it felt almost organic. I muted the TV. The sound stayed. I tried pinpointing it by walking through the living room. No change. I stepped into the kitchen. Same volume. It didn't get louder or quieter depending on where I moved inside the house. It just wrapped around everything. It was like being inside a large instrument someone was slowly tuning. I checked my phone. No notifications. The battery percentage flickered by a single digit, like it couldn't decide what number to show, but that happened sometimes when it got cold. I went to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly. The yard looked normal, at least in the vague way a yard at night looks normal. Dim porch light on the neighbor's garage, a few leaves scattered across the lawn, the street lamp at the end of the block flickering a little like it always did. But the sound wasn't coming from the street, or from the sky, or from the ground. It wasn't directional at all. I tried not to get worked up. Strange noises happen. Houses shift. Utilities hum. But something about the steadiness of it made me uneasy. You know how your brain tries to fit new sensations into categories you already understand? Mine had nothing to work with. The hum wasn't electrical, wasn't mechanical, wasn't human. I put my ear against the living room wall. No change. Basement door, same volume. Bathroom, same. It didn't get louder or softer based on proximity to anything solid. It just existed at a level that felt like it was coming through the air itself. A rhythmic rise and fall, slow, almost patterned, like breathing, except too even. I went back to the living room window, tried to listen carefully. My ears strained until they almost rang. The hum stayed perfectly steady. Something about that annoyed me more than scared me. I grabbed my coat, shoved my feet into my shoes, and headed for the front door. If something outside was making the noise, I wanted to see it instead of imagining shadows. The hum continued all the way to the entryway. Then literally the second, I twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The sound cut off, not faded, stopped, like someone flipped a switch. The silence hit so quickly it felt physical, like walking into a vacuum. The porch was still. No wind. No crickets. No passing cars. I stepped outside and looked around. The street was empty. A lone delivery truck rumbled 2 blocks away, but it didn't make the humming start again. No planes overhead, no transformer buzzing, no neighbor's heat pump running, just silence. I took a few steps into the yard, feeling foolish. I waited a long moment, letting the stillness settle. Nothing. I headed back inside. The door clicked shut behind me. 5 seconds later, the hum returned. Not gradually, not like something spinning up, just there again. Same volume, same rhythm. I froze in the entryway. My first thought, stupid but automatic, was that someone was messing with me. But who would do that? And how? The hum didn't match anything a speaker could make, and it didn't vibrate the floor or walls. It wasn't directional enough to be something hidden inside. It was like the air inside the house was humming. I opened the door again. Instant silence. Closed it. Hum. I did it 4 more times because my brain refused to accept something so cleanly impossible. Hum. Silence. Hum. Silence. A perfect on-off response triggered by stepping over the threshold. I walked to the back door, wondering if maybe the front yard had something strange happening. Same thing. Inside. Hum. Outside. Silence. By now, the hairs on my arms were standing up. My chest felt tight in a way that wasn't fear exactly, just this deep discomfort, like my instincts were trying to warn me before the rest of my mind caught up. I turned on all the lights and walked room to room, trying to distract myself with normal tasks. Washed a couple dishes, picked up clutter. The hum didn't change, didn't get louder when I ran the sink, didn't react when I turned on the stove fan. It was too constant for that. At one point while I was in the hallway, the lights dimmed very slightly. Not flickering, just dipping like a brownout. The hum didn't change at all. When the lights brightened again, I checked my phone. The screen took a full second to wake up, which it never did before. Then the battery percentage started slipping, 62, 56, 49, before jumping back to 63. None of that made any sense. I turned airplane mode on. The hum didn't react. Around midnight, something new happened. The rhythm of the hum shifted, just one single cycle shorter than the others, like it skipped a beat. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed instantly. Then it went right back to normal. I stood still in the hallway, listening hard. Another skip, not at a regular interval, just once every few minutes. Each time it skipped, the air felt slightly heavier, like humidity increasing even though the house was dry. My ears felt full, like pressure was increasing or decreasing too subtly to measure. Around 12:30, the hum deepened by maybe half a tone. I'm not musical, but I swear the frequency changed. The sound grew just a tiny bit more resonant, like something adjusting itself. I'd reached the point where sitting still felt worse than moving, so I grabbed my keys and jacket. My plan was simple. Open the door, step outside, and walk until I heard something normal again. But when I opened the front door, the hum still stopped instantly. And I mean instantly. The moment the latch let go. Before the door even swung open, I stepped onto the porch. Silence. My ears rang from the sudden absence of sound. The street lamp flickered once and steadied. I walked a little down the sidewalk, my breath visible in the cold air. Nothing followed me. No hum, no weird pressure. The world was normal. But when I walked back and crossed through the doorway, the hum resumed as if it had just been waiting for me. This time, something else happened. The hallway light dimmed again for a moment. Not enough to go out, just a brief pulse. The air felt thick for a few seconds. The hum skipped again. I stood in the doorway, half inside, half outside, seeing if the sound would cut in and out depending on where I stood. It didn't. The line wasn't the threshold exactly, more like once the door was fully closed. Door cracked open. Silence. Door closed. Hum. I did not like that at all. Eventually, I left the door open and sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, just listening to the night. Normal night sounds came back, an occasional car, wind through branches, the rustle of a cat jumping onto a trash can. I kept glancing at the open doorway behind me. From outside, the house looked normal, lights glowing softly, everything still. But the moment I stood and nudged the door halfway closed, I heard it, the faintest beginning of the hum. Like something inside was preparing to start up again. I opened the door wider. Silence. I didn't go back inside for another hour. I paced the yard, sat on the steps, kept zoning out, listening for anything unusual. Nothing happened. Nothing strange outside. But eventually, at around 2 a.m., I had to go back in. The cold was getting to me. The second I shut the door fully, the hum returned, in the exact same tone and rhythm as before, as if no time had passed. I barely slept. By morning, the noise was gone. The house sounded normal again. My phone charged fine. The lights didn't dim. Everything worked as if nothing had happened. But the next night, around 11:15, the hum started again. Softer this time, but undeniably the same sound. And when I checked very slowly by cracking the door open, silence. Closed, hum. I haven't figured out anything about it except one thing. Whatever is causing the humming doesn't want to be heard from the outside. Whatever it is, it only exists, only behaves that way when the house is closed up, fully sealed. I don't know why. But every night since, before I go to bed, I stand at the front door for a long time with my hand hovering over the knob, listening for that low, rhythmic sound that shouldn't be there. And every time I open the door, the silence on the other side feels a little too deliberate. I woke up because something in the house felt wrong. Not a sound, at least not at first. More like a vibration under the mattress, like someone had put a phone on silent mode and shoved it under the bed frame. It was just enough to pull me out of sleep. When I actually opened my eyes, I realized it wasn't the bed vibrating. It was the walls. A low humming, steady and smooth, not mechanical. It wasn't coming from the pipes or the vents. It was inside the drywall somehow, spreading through the room like a held note. I sat there for a few seconds, half awake and confused, trying to figure out if I had left something plugged in. The moment I pushed myself upright, the humming stopped. Not faded, stopped, like someone flipped a switch. I sat completely still, waiting for it to start again. Nothing. The house felt too quiet after that. No refrigerator hum, no furnace sound, not even the faint ticking of the baseboard heater. It was like the place was holding its breath. I got out of bed slowly and went to the window. I live in a small rental house just outside Marquette, up in northern Michigan. My bedroom faces the woods behind the property. Dense trees, no streetlights, nothing but darkness at night unless the moon is bright. When I pulled the curtains back, the entire sky was glowing white. Not bright white, more like the color of a sheet held over a flashlight. A soft, even glow that had no direction, no source. The trees in the backyard were all silhouettes, sharp and perfectly still. I didn't see any flickering or clouds reflecting city light. It wasn't lightning either. It held steady for maybe 2 seconds. Then it vanished, just pure darkness again, like someone cut the power to the sky. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something else to happen, but everything stayed still. I didn't even hear wind. I ended up staring at my own reflection in the glass, trying to decide if I'd dreamed the whole thing. I checked the clock, 3:08 a.m. My phone said the same. Notifications were normal. Power was on. Everything looked totally ordinary, except for the feeling in my chest, like I was slightly off balance. I went to the kitchen to get water because my mouth felt dry. As soon as I stepped into the hall, the humming started again. Not the same intensity. This time it was softer, more diffused, like the noise was coming through the floor instead of the walls. It vibrated up through my legs and into my ribs, quiet enough that I wondered if I was imagining it, but strong enough to feel. I froze, listening. The sound didn't pulse or shift. It didn't get louder or quieter. It just existed. Constant and even, like an engine idling far underground. Then it cut off, again instantly. I took a few more steps, and it didn't start again. I grabbed a glass of water and stood by the sink. The backyard was completely black through the window. No porch light, no neighbors, no stars. The sky looked unusually empty. When I walked back toward the bedroom, I noticed something I hadn't before. The hallway seemed colder. Not window open cold, but a dry, thin cold that felt unnatural for a house heated by baseboards. Goosebumps rose on my arms, even though the thermostat was set to 69. I put my hand flat against the wall. It was vibrating, very faintly but unmistakable. I pulled my hand back and felt it without touching, just hovering a half-inch away. The air next to the wall felt almost electric. I stepped backward toward the living room. The vibrations stopped. Then, from the bedroom, a soft thump, like someone lightly knocking on the inside of the wall. I nearly dropped the glass. My bedroom light was still off, but the door was open enough that I could see the faint outline of the bed, the dresser. Nothing moved. The sound didn't repeat. I stood there for probably 30 seconds, then forced myself to go back in and check. I turned on the light. Everything was exactly the same. No humming, no vibration, no glowing sky. I got back in bed eventually, but I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle like normal. It wasn't until around 4:30 that anything else happened. A soft click, like the sound a lamp makes when turning off, came from the corner of the room where the outlet is. Except the lamp wasn't even plugged in. I had unplugged it 2 days earlier to charge a vacuum. Right after the click, the humming returned. Not loudly, this time it was barely there, like a breath under the floorboards. My pillow seemed to pick it up, vibrating a little under my cheek. I sat up too fast and the humming cut off mid-note. The silence afterward felt even louder. That's when I noticed the trees outside were swaying even though there was no wind. Not a lot, just a subtle rocking motion, like something was pushing air through them. But the leaves weren't rustling. It was as if they were moving without making sound. I watched them for a long time. And then, for maybe a second or two, the sky brightened again. That faint white glow washed everything out. The branches, the yard, the edges of the window frame. My room filled with reflected light even though nothing inside was actually lit. Then it vanished again. I checked the clock, 4:42 a.m. No time jump, nothing strange there. I thought about calling someone, but who do you call for something like that? It wasn't an emergency, and I didn't even know if it was real. Around dawn, I finally fell asleep for a bit, maybe 2 hours. When I woke up, the house felt completely normal, warmer, noisier, alive in the usual way. Birds were making noise outside. A delivery truck rumbled past on the road. Whatever had happened during the night left no trace. No power fluctuations, no weird marks, no damage. Still, I walked around checking everything just to be sure. Walls felt normal. Floor felt normal. The trees looked fine. It was like nothing had happened. I tried to forget about it, or at least chalk it up to half dreaming. But the thing that keeps sticking with me is this. When I opened my phone that morning, the battery was down to 3%. It had been at 68 when I went to bed. There were no apps open, no background processes, no calls or messages. But when I tapped the battery usage chart, there was a huge unexplained drop right at 3 a.m. The graph just plunged straight down. No reason given. I've been charging it next to my bed for years, and it's never done that before. I haven't heard the humming since, and the sky hasn't glowed again. But sometimes late at night, when the house gets very quiet, I catch myself listening, waiting for that low vibration to start up again behind the walls, just to know whether it was real. The water was so still that morning it looked more like glass than a lake. I remember that clearly. It was early, around 5, one of those September mornings where the cold sits right on your skin, but the air smells clean enough that you don't mind. I'd driven out to Cedar Basin to fish before work, something I didn't get to do often anymore. I parked near the South Shore, hiked down the slope, and set up near a cluster of reeds where the trout usually bit. There was a faint mist on the surface, drifting in patches. The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky had that dim bluish color that hinted morning wasn't far off. The only sound was the occasional plunk of my lure hitting the water and the soft rustle of the reeds. I was alone, at least as far as I knew. I just cast out again, letting the line settle when I noticed something beneath the surface. At first, it was just a tiny point of brightness, like someone had dropped a waterproof flashlight way down in the lake. I assumed it was a reflection, maybe from a star still hanging on above the horizon, but traveled and it moved. It traveled in a perfectly cutting under the water, and it cut no ripple with rill, no disturbance, just this sharp white point slipping through the dark, too fast to be a swimmer, too steady to be a fish. And definitely not a boat. Boats don't glide underwater. I stood up, squinting, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the point kept going, and as it got closer to the shore, I realized it wasn't just light reflecting off something. It was its own light, bright enough that it glowed through the water like a spark. Then it stopped, dead stop, as if it hit an invisible wall beneath the lake. The hairs on my arms lifted. The whole air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike, even though the sky was clear. Before I could make sense of it, the light jerked upward, not rising like a bubble or a fish surfacing, shooting, a straight vertical line, fast enough that I barely saw it cross the surface. There was no splash, no ripple, nothing that made physical sense. One moment the light was under the water, the next it was in the air, leaving a faint streak behind it like a camera exposure. It climbed so high, so fast that by the time I'd blinked, it was already above the tree line. Then it just vanished into the sky, swallowed by the dim blue above me. I stood there for a long time, rod dangling in my hand, waiting for something to follow. Sound, wind, anything. The lake stayed perfectly calm. I reeled in my line and tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of drone underwater? But drones don't move like that, and they don't shoot out of the water silently. And who would be flying one in the dark at 5 in the morning in the middle of Cedar Basin? I was still staring at the lake when something else felt off. The mist that had been drifting across the water earlier had frozen in place. Not literally frozen. It wasn't solid. But it wasn't moving. It just hovered there, like time had paused for it. The air was still, yet the mist stayed in these perfect, unmoving shapes. Then, slowly, it began to drift again, as if whatever had disturbed it was gone. I packed up sooner than I planned. I wasn't scared exactly, just unsettled. I kept glancing over my shoulder on the hike back up the slope, expecting to see another light move under the surface or something watching from the trees. When I got to my truck, the radio flickered. Not on and off, just a tiny hiccup in the static of the unused channel I normally kept it on during the early mornings. A half-second skip, enough that I noticed. Then, as I pulled out onto the dirt road, the truck's dashboard lights dimmed. Only for a second, just long enough to make me take my foot off the gas. I drove home without turning on the radio again. For the rest of the day, everything felt slightly off kilter. At work, my coworker Sam asked if I was sick. I told him I was fine, just tired. I didn't bring up the light. I couldn't picture how to explain it without sounding like I'd lost it. The next morning, I went back to Cedar Basin. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof I hadn't imagined it. Maybe I thought the lake would look normal in daylight and I'd be able to laugh it off. But the moment I got out of the truck, something felt wrong. Birds usually chirped around there at sunrise. Jays, sparrows, the occasional hawk. That morning, nothing. Total silence. The kind that feels heavy, like sound is being swallowed. I walked down to the water and stopped abruptly when I saw the reeds. The tops of them were pressed flat, not like they'd been bent by wind, but pushed straight down, like something had hovered just above them. A perfect circle, maybe 4 feet across. I crouched down and touched the flattened tops. They were cold, much colder than the surrounding vegetation. The lake itself looked normal. No glow, no ripples, nothing unusual, but when I tossed a small stone toward the surface to test the water, it hit with barely any splash, just a tiny plip and then silence. The sound felt muted, as if the air itself was dampening it. I didn't stay long. That night, around 3 in the morning, Hazel, my dog, started whining. She paced near the back door, ears pointed backward, tail down. When I stepped outside with her, the air felt thick, not humid, just heavy, like walking into a room with pressure built up. I looked up at the sky on instinct. There was a faint glow overhead. Not bright, not like a beam or anything dramatic, just a soft white patch drifting between the stars. Warmer in color than the moon, cooler than a streetlight. It moved slowly across the sky, in the same direction the light in the lake had shot. My breath fogged in front of me, even though the night wasn't cold enough for that. Hazel pressed against my leg, trembling. The glow faded as it crossed behind a cloud. I waited for it to come out on the other side. It didn't. The cloud itself dimmed, like the glow was still behind it, but when the cloud drifted away, the sky was empty. I stayed outside until Hazel tugged me back toward the house. A few nights later, I woke up without knowing why. No sound, no dream, nothing obvious. Just that feeling of suddenly being awake. I glanced at the clock, 3:42 a.m. Out of habit, I looked toward the window. For the briefest moment, less than a second, I saw a faint white reflection flicker across the glass, as if something bright had moved outside. When I sat up to look, the yard was dark, totally still. I checked the clock again, 3:45 a.m. 3 minutes gone. Not a long time, but long enough that I knew I hadn't looked away or fallen asleep again. It was just missing. I still fish at Cedar Basin sometimes, but never before sunrise. I can't bring myself to sit alone by that water in the dark, waiting for something to move beneath it. And every once in a while, usually on clear nights, I'll see a faint patch of sky drift. Not a cloud, not a spotlight. Just a soft blur sliding between the stars. Always moving in the same direction. I was sitting in the backyard with my friend Ryan, just killing time after dinner. It was one of those warm, dry summer nights in eastern Colorado where everything feels quiet but not empty. The sky was clear enough that you could see the Milky Way without trying, and we were just leaning back in a couple of old lawn chairs my landlord left behind. We weren't doing anything special, just talking about work, the usual stuff. At one point, Ryan stopped mid-sentence and squinted upward. "Hey," he said, lifting his chin, "that star's weird." I followed his gesture. At first, I didn't even know which one he meant. There were a lot of stars, and I wasn't exactly an expert, but he kept pointing until I found it, a bright white dot a little above the tree line to the west. "What's weird about it?" I asked. "It keeps blinking?" "No, not blinking, something else." I stared at it. It didn't look like much at first. But the longer I watched, the more I noticed it wasn't twinkling like a normal star. The brightness was changing, but not randomly. It was rising and lowering in an actual pattern. Soft, bright, dim, soft, bright, dim, steady, like a slow heartbeat. I opened my mouth to say something when Ryan said, "It's doing that on purpose, right?" I almost laughed, but I didn't. Something about the rhythm made my skin tighten a little. Stars didn't pulse like that. At least not stars I'd ever seen. We watched it for another 30 seconds or so. It didn't move, didn't drift, just pulsed. Then it stopped entirely. It held steady like any other star. "Well," Ryan said, exhaling, "okay then." We both tried to shrug it off, but the mood shifted. The yard felt too still, the air too warm. I kept glancing back up at that star, even though I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But once you notice something off, you can't unsee it. After a few minutes, Ryan checked his phone. "I should head out," he said. He lived a few blocks down the street and usually walked when he came over. I told him I'd walk part of the way with him because I wasn't tired yet. We left my yard and started down the sidewalk. Houses were dark, most people already in bed. The streetlights weren't bright, more of a dim amber glow, and they didn't fill the gaps between the poles. It made the spaces between them feel darker than usual. I noticed the star again when we reached the corner. It had started pulsing again. "Dude, look," I said. Ryan groaned but turned around anyway. "Seriously?" We watched it for maybe 20 seconds. Pulse, dim, pulse, dim. "Let's keep walking," he muttered. "I don't like it." We kept going, but I could tell he was watching the ground on purpose, just so he wouldn't have to look up again. A few houses down, the cicadas suddenly cut out. Not slowly, just gone all at once, like someone hit mute on the whole street. Ryan stopped walking. "Did you hear?" "Yeah." He looked at me, uncertain. I didn't say anything because I didn't trust my voice not to shake a little. The silence felt thick. I could hear my own heartbeat, which I usually never notice. Then the streetlight above us flickered once. Not out, just a momentary dip. We looked at each other again. "Maybe a transformer?" I said, though it sounded weak. Before he could reply, a shape crossed overhead. I didn't see the whole thing, just a brief, dark silhouette gliding across the sky, blocking part of the stars as it went. No noise, no wind. Nothing to tell how big or close it was, just a smooth shadow passing above the neighborhood. Ryan swore under his breath. We both looked up at the pulsing star again, but it wasn't pulsing anymore. It was gone. Not dimmed, not faded. Gone. We stood there for maybe a minute, not moving. The cicadas started again, but it didn't help. Their sound felt thin, like background noise in a video instead of something alive. "I'm going home," Ryan said quietly. "I'll text you." I watched him leave, but I didn't head back to my house right away. I don't know why. Something felt unfinished, like if I moved too soon, I'd miss whatever came next. A breeze picked up, hot, dry, not cooling at all. When it brushed past me, I felt a faint pressure against my ears, almost like a plane passing overhead, except the air stayed completely still after. No sound followed, no plane. I looked up at where the star had been, nothing but regular sky. But as I started walking back toward my house, I noticed something else. My shadow. Under the nearby streetlight, it looked normal at first. Then, as I stepped forward, it lengthened unnaturally far behind me, longer than the streetlight should have cast. And the streetlight wasn't flickering. I stopped walking. My shadow didn't. For half a second, maybe less, it lagged, like the ground beneath me was catching up. Then it snapped back into place. I actually gasped. It felt like the bottom dropped out of my stomach. Everything seemed to return to normal after that. My shadow looked fine. The streetlight glowed steadily, but every step back to my driveway felt like wading through a bad dream where your legs don't quite work right. When I got inside, I locked the door without thinking. I checked the windows. I checked the backyard again through the glass. The sky looked totally ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went to brush my teeth, and when I walked back into the living room, I noticed a faint light on the ceiling. A soft circular reflection, like someone standing outside was shining a weak flashlight upward through the window. I pulled the blinds open fast, but nothing was there. Just my yard, my fence, the neighbor's shed. The reflection on the ceiling faded immediately. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept picturing that steady, unnatural pulse in the sky, the rhythm of it, the way it looked intentional. The next morning, Ryan texted me saying he didn't want to talk about it, which was weird because he's usually the type to send 20 messages about anything weird that happens. As the day went on, I checked the sky a few more times without really meaning to. The stars looked normal that night, completely normal. No pulses, no shapes, no shadows acting wrong. But sometimes when I'm outside and letting my eyes adjust, I feel myself staring at the same patch of sky where that star had been, half expecting it to blink back on. Not twinkling, just waiting. The notification popped up on my phone at 2:17 a.m., a single line from my security app that said, "Motion detected, backyard." I only checked it because I was already half awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the pipes tick in the walls. I sat up and opened the live feed. The screen showed the usual view of my yard. Patchy grass, the old maple tree by the fence, and the corner of the shed where the paint had started peeling. Everything looked still. No raccoons, no stray cats, no person creeping around, just the faint glow from the neighbor's porch light bleeding in from the side. Then I scrubbed back a few seconds to see what triggered it. There was a soft flash. Not a bright burst, not like a camera strobe. More like the yard briefly filled with pale light, as if something had reflected off metal and bounced through the space. It lasted maybe half a second. The tree and fence glowed and then went normal again. No source, no reflection point, just sudden light and darkness. I noticed the timestamp jump from 2:16:22 to 2:17:22. Exactly 1 minute missing. I frowned at my screen, thumb hovering over the playback bar. The app had glitched before, but never like that. Usually it just stuttered or froze for a second. I rewound it again, slower this time. Same thing. Normal night, then the faint flash, then the time skipping ahead. I pushed the covers back and slipped out of bed, trying not to wake my dog, Miko, curled at the foot. My apartment was cold enough that the tile made my feet tense up when I stepped into the hallway. The backyard door was locked. I checked it anyway. Then I flicked on the porch light and peered through the glass. Nothing looked different. The grass was still wet from the earlier mist. The air outside hung heavy and cool, and the neighbor's wind chimes clinked weakly in the distance. I slid the door open a few inches. The night air rolled in, damp and quiet. No smell of smoke, no odd chemical scent, just the faint earthy smell of wet soil. I stepped out onto the concrete slab and stood there, listening. No insects, no distant traffic. Even the usual hum from the power lines near the road felt quieter than normal. I checked the yard with my phone's flashlight, sweeping it slowly across the fence line, the base of the tree, the side of the shed. The beam caught on nothing unusual. No flattened grass, no marks, no objects I didn't recognize. Still, that light bothered me. I went back inside and sat on the couch, staring at the camera feed again. It had returned to normal, timestamp advancing steadily. The yard looked boring and calm, like it had always been. Around 2:40, I noticed something else. The wind chime stopped completely. Not slowed, just stopped. The leaves on the tree didn't twitch. The faint breeze I'd felt earlier was gone. The camera view showed the yard frozen like a still photo. Then the screen flickered, not fully. Just a thin horizontal band of distortion slid across the image and vanished. I leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "Come on," I muttered. Miko lifted her head and let out a low, uncertain huff. That wasn't normal for her. She stayed quiet unless someone knocked. I glanced toward the back door again, listening. There was a faint sound outside. Not footsteps. Not quite. More like a soft shifting, almost like fabric brushing over grass, slow and steady. I held my breath and watched the screen. Nothing moved. No shadows crossed the yard. No figure passed through frame. Then the faint glow returned. This time it wasn't a flash. It hung for a second, illuminating a patch of grass near the fence about 5 feet in diameter. It didn't cast hard shadows, just a dull, pale wash of light that felt slightly out of place. The timestamp flickered again, 2:41 to 2:42:3. Another missing minute. My stomach tightened. I grabbed a hoodie and slipped my shoes on, even though every part of me said I shouldn't go back out there. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch again. The air felt thicker now. Not humid exactly, just heavier, like it pushed back slightly when I moved forward. I stood on the edge of the concrete, staring into the yard. The patch where the light had appeared looked normal again. The grass stood upright, glistening faintly. No scorch, no impression, no sign it had been lit up at all. But the quiet was wrong. Even when nothing happened, there was usually background noise. Crickets, traffic, air moving. This felt like being inside a paused moment. I took a slow step off the porch. The grass gave a soft crunch under my shoe, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been. I moved another step closer to the fence and waited. A low hum pulsed through the air, not loud, barely there, like a distant engine miles away, except it didn't rise or fall. It just existed, steady and flat. I glanced upward. The sky was cloudy, low sheets of gray drifting lazily over a barely visible moon. No aircraft lights, no stars. The hum faded, and the air went dead still again. I backed up toward the porch, unease settling deeper in my bones. Inside, I checked the camera once more. The feed had stabilized. No glow, no flicker, just the yard as it always looked. I didn't sleep much after that. Every tiny sound made me shift my eyes toward the back door. Miko refused to leave my side. By morning, the sky had turned pale and hazy, the kind of gray that made everything feel muted. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and looked around for anything out of place. The yard looked entirely ordinary. No marks, no dents, no broken plants, not even disturbed dirt. I pulled up the recording again on my phone as I stood there. The flashes and skipped minutes remained. Everything in between showed the yard waiting, empty and unbothered. Around 9:30, I noticed the maple tree casting an odd shadow line across the lawn, perfectly straight, sharper than the others. It slowly softened as the sun shifted, then disappeared. I told myself it was just the angle of light. Still, I left the camera app open all day. Nothing else happened. No alerts, no strange flashes. By evening, I almost convinced myself the whole thing had been a system glitch mixed with poor sleep. But when I checked the yard one last time before bed, I noticed the grass near the fence swayed slightly, even though the rest of the yard remained still. No wind, no sound. Just that small patch moving slowly, like something had passed through it moments before. I watched it for a long time until it stilled again. The camera stayed silent through the night after that. No more flashes, no skipped time. But every time I glanced at the dark window, I had the uneasy sense that something had already figured out how my yard looked from above and was deciding when to come back. Walking home late, every reflective surface ahead briefly glowed at once. Storefront windows, car mirrors, puddles along the curb, even the brushed metal on a bus stop pole, all lit up like someone had swept a pale flashlight across the whole street. The glow faded almost instantly, and when it did, everything looked duller than before, like the night had thickened. I slowed down without thinking and looked up, expecting to see a helicopter or some badly aimed floodlight. The sky was low and foggy, the kind that swallowed stars and made the street lamps look like they were underwater. It had been spitting light rain on and off all evening, just enough to leave the pavement slick, but not enough to feel like real weather. My name is Jonah Pritchard. I lived in a second-floor apartment near the old canal in Merriwick, one of those towns that used to have factories and now mostly had empty brick buildings and a couple bars trying too hard. I'd worked late at the print shop and was heading home along the river path instead of the main road, mostly because it was quieter. After the glow, the path felt off. The lamps were still on, but their light didn't seem to reach as far as it should have. It wasn't darker exactly, just flatter, like my eyes weren't adjusting right. I checked behind me. No one. A couple parked cars, a damp bench, and the slow roll of fog creeping off the canal. The only sound was my shoes on wet gravel and the faint slap of water against the concrete bank. I kept walking, but every now and then I caught tiny flashes in the corner of my vision, like quick reflections that didn't match anything around me. I stopped near an old row of boarded up storefronts, watching the ground. The puddles were still, no ripples, no breeze. My breath came out steady. A low hum slipped through the air for a few seconds. It wasn't loud, more like pressure than sound, the kind that made your teeth feel slightly tight. Then it stopped as suddenly as it started. Further down the street, a bike leaned against a railing. Its chrome handlebar ends caught another brief shimmer, barely a second long, then went matte again. I stared at it, half expecting it to flare up again, but it stayed dull. "I'm just tired," I muttered, even though my voice sounded strange in the quiet. I resumed walking, faster now. My heartbeat had picked up, not panic, but alert, like my body was noticing something my brain couldn't quite name. As I passed the old corner deli, the glass door rattled lightly, even though there was no wind. The bell inside didn't move. The hum returned, deeper this time, followed by a faint sensation like the soles of my shoes were vibrating against the ground. I froze again. The vibration lasted maybe 5 seconds, then faded out like something moving away. When I looked ahead, every reflective surface along the next block flickered together once more. Not bright, just enough to register. The windows of parked cars, the glossy paint on a fire hydrant, a wet mailbox. All of it responded like it was reacting to something passing through. But the street itself remained empty. Something about the way the reflections behaved made my skin crawl. It wasn't random, it felt timed, coordinated. I glanced at my phone. The screen reflected my face back at me in the dimness. For a split second, the reflection brightened, then dulled again. The time read 12:11 a.m. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, suddenly sure I didn't want any more light. A dog barked once somewhere far off, then another, then silence. I turned onto Alder Row, a stretch that usually had at least some traffic noise from the highway, but tonight it felt sealed off. The fog thickened, swallowing the end of the street in a gray wall. Halfway down the block, I noticed something drifting across the reflective surface of a window. Not a person, not a shadow with a clear edge. Just a slow, soft blur that moved against the shape of the glass like something passing close by, though there was nothing actually there. I stepped closer, staring, heart thudding. Nothing. But my own reflection looked slightly off. Stretched like the night behind me was deeper than it should have been. The hum returned again, longer now, steady and low. My chest felt tight. The air seemed heavier, as though the humidity had doubled all at once. Then every reflective surface lit up again, brighter this time. Not blinding, just clear. A pale wash that rolled forward down the street like a wave, hitting windows, puddles, metal, then passing on. And after it went, the street looked darker than before. Like the lamps had collectively dimmed, even though I knew they hadn't. I hurried now, boots splashing through shallow puddles. My breathing was quick and sharp, fogging in the damp air. I could feel that same hum through my legs again, faint but undeniable. I reached the bridge over the canal and gripped the cold railing, trying to steady myself. The water below was black, barely moving. The reflections of the streetlights shivered slightly, then smoothed out again. Across the canal, I spotted a faint glow hovering maybe 20 feet above the tree line. Soft and muted, the same color as the earlier reflections, but suspended like a blurred star hovering too low to make sense. It drifted slowly to the right, perfectly level, making no sound at all. I stood there watching it, barely breathing. It didn't flash, didn't pulse. It just hovered, calm and deliberate, like it belonged. Then it slid further into the fog and disappeared. The hum stopped at the same moment. The air felt lighter after that, though my hands were still shaking. I forced myself to keep walking, every step feeling too loud. When I finally reached my apartment building, the entry lights looked normal again, casting their usual yellow circle. No strange reflections, no flickers, just boring concrete and tired brick. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and pine cleaner. The familiar creak of my floorboards felt grounding in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I locked the door behind me, checked it twice, and leaned my forehead against the wood for a second, letting my breathing slow. When I pulled the curtains aside, the window reflected my dim living room back at me. For a heartbeat, the glass shimmered faintly, like the afterimage of a light that wasn't there anymore. Then it settled into stillness. I stood there a while longer, waiting for another glow, another hum, anything to happen. Nothing did. The night stayed quiet, but the feeling of the street being just slightly wrong never fully faded. The warm air hit me like I'd stepped into a different pocket of weather. It was just after sunset, that low, dull orange phase where everything loses its sharp edges, and I was cutting across the open field behind the Renshaw property to save time getting home. I'd done it 100 times before. It was an empty stretch of uneven grass, a few scattered weeds, and a line of bare trees at the far end that marked the creek. Quiet, predictable, safe enough. Except that evening, about halfway through, the temperature suddenly shifted. The rest of the field was cool, the usual early fall chill creeping up through the soles of my shoes. Then I stepped forward and felt warmth roll over my face and arms like I'd walked too close to a space heater. It wasn't wind. It wasn't sunlight. The sun was already almost gone. I stopped instinctively and looked down at the ground, half expecting something obvious like smoldering grass or some weird vent. Nothing. Just flat earth and faintly bent stems. I moved my foot forward another step, still warm. Behind me, cool air again. In front, warmer. The change was so precise it didn't feel natural. I lifted my eyes and followed the air upward. That's when I saw the shimmer. It hovered about 10 feet above the ground, barely visible unless you angled your head just right. A faint distortion, like heat rippling off asphalt, but slower and more controlled. It pulsed gently, not flickering, not aggressive. Just pulsing, like a breath. "What is that?" I murmured, though the field swallowed the sound. My name's Eric Coleman, and I work delivery most days, so I spent a lot of time outside. I knew how the air moved. I knew how heat rose. This didn't behave like anything normal. The shimmer held its spot above the warm patch, its edges soft and undefined. No color, just slight warping of the air, enough to make the horizon behind it wobble faintly. I shifted my weight, unsure if stepping closer or farther made more sense. A faint smell hung in the air too. Not smoke, not grass. Something neutral and metallic, like cold pennies left in the sun. I took one slow step closer. The warmth deepened slightly, but the shimmer didn't change position. No sound came from it. No buzzing. No movement other than that steady pulse. I glanced around the field, half expecting someone else to be standing there staring at the same thing. No one. The town sat quiet behind me. A faint dog barked somewhere far off, then silence returned. The shimmer pulsed again. I couldn't explain why, but the longer I watched it, the more the sense of being noticed crept in, slow and cold beneath the warmth. Not watched by eyes, just acknowledged. I lifted my hand tentatively toward it. The air near my fingertips felt slightly heavier, like pushing into humidity too early in the day. I didn't touch anything. There was nothing to touch. But as I pulled my hand back, the shimmer briefly brightened, just a fraction, then softened again. My stomach tightened. "This isn't right," I whispered. The pulse slowed. The warmth around my legs and chest remained consistent and calm. Time felt stretched thin, like the moment had more space than it should. I took a cautious step backward. The warmth lingered for half a second, then faded as my foot left that patch of ground. The air surrounding me returned to cool and crisp like the rest of the evening. The shimmer remained suspended. I swallowed and stepped back again, exiting the warm zone fully. Now I stood just outside it, looking into that slightly distorted pocket of air. It kept pulsing. Not following treating, just existing. A breeze stirred through the field, bending the tall grass around it, but the shimmer didn't waver. The warm pocket didn't move. Everything else obeyed the wind, but that space felt immune. I stood there unsure how long, seconds or minutes blurring together. Then the shimmer began to thin. At first, it just softened, the distortion becoming less defined, like someone slowly lowering the opacity of it. The warmth weakened slightly. The pulse grew more subtle. The shimmer's edges faded slowly outward, the air returning to normal clarity piece by piece. The warm zone cooled at the same time. No sudden change, no drama, just a careful dissolving. Within a few moments, nothing remained. The field looked exactly the same as it had every other day of my life, except now I knew something had briefly occupied that spot. I stood there longer, breathing steady but shallow, staring at the place where it had been, waiting for any sign it would return. Nothing did. The air felt identical everywhere now, cool and ordinary. I stepped forward tentatively into the spot. No warmth, no shimmer, just flattened grass and fading light. A breeze pushed through again, rustling weeds and brushing against my jacket, as if trying to remind me that the world still worked the way it always had. I started walking again, slower this time, glancing over my shoulder once every few steps. The field stayed empty. The trees stood still. The sky dimmed further into a hazy dusk. When I reached the far end near the gravel road, I stopped and looked back one last time. No distortion, no heat, just a quiet piece of land absorbing the last traces of daylight. I walked the rest of the way home in silence, the normal sounds of evening slowly returning around me. Crickets starting up, a distant TV through an open window, something like normal life. Inside my house, everything felt the same too. No lingering warmth on my skin, no odd smell, just quiet, worn comfort. Still, when I changed out of my jacket, I noticed my sleeves felt slightly warm near the cuffs, like they'd been near something heated a little too long. By full nightfall, that warmth had faded too. But the memory of that pulsing shimmer above the field stayed sharp, tucked behind my thoughts, weightless and unexplained, like it had only passed through for a moment and left before it needed to justify itself. The light didn't behave like anything I'd ever seen on that stretch of road. I was driving east on County Route 17, the road that cuts straight through miles of flat farmland just outside of Glenora. It was early evening, that soft, dusty hour right before the sun fully disappeared, and the sky had that washed-out orange look that made every field seem endless. The air felt warm, even with the windows cracked, and dry wind carried the faint smell of cut hay across the asphalt. I'd taken that road 1,000 times. I knew every curve, every broken reflector, every stretch where the corn leaned too close to the shoulder. There wasn't supposed to be anything new out there. No buildings, no street lights, no reason for anything to glow. That's why the steady light hovering above the crops made no sense. At first, I thought it might be a distant tractor or some farmer using a lantern. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't attached to anything. No poles, no vehicle. Just a pale white glow floating maybe 4 or 5 feet above the corn rows, moving slowly alongside the field as if pacing my car. It didn't flicker. It didn't sway. It didn't cast any visible beam onto the plants below it. It just existed. My name's Jared Malon, and I'd spent most of my life around rural roads and quiet nights. I knew what headlights looked like from weird angles. I knew reflections. I knew fog tricks. This wasn't any of that. I slowed down without meaning to, eyes fixed on the strange light. It glided smoothly sideways, parallel to the road, completely silent. No buzzing, no mechanical sound, no hum. The corn under it didn't glow brighter. The shadows didn't shift. It wasn't illuminating anything at all. I rolled the window down further, leaning slightly toward the passenger side to get a better look. Warm air rushed over my forearm, but the light stayed steady, just drifting. "What are you?" I said under my breath. The radio played faint through the speakers, some talk show I barely paid attention to, but the moment felt isolated, like the rest of the world had lowered its volume. A pickup truck passed in the opposite direction, headlights washing across my windshield. For a second, the light disappeared behind that glare. Then it came back, still floating, still moving, perfectly calm. My chest tightened with a quiet kind of unease that didn't spike into panic, but made me painfully aware that something wasn't right. I tapped my brake and slowed further, matching its pace. The light didn't react, didn't drift closer or farther, just kept sliding through the air at a precise distance from the crops, like following an invisible track. I glanced around, trying to spot any wires, structures, or poles that might connect to it. There was nothing but open fields in the fading sky. The sun dropped lower, brushing the horizon in faint gold. The light didn't change. I watched it for what felt like a full minute, though time moved strangely thin in that moment. Then, without warning or build-up, it slid slightly upward, angled just a bit, and vanished. Not faded, vanished. 1 second it was there. The next, nothing. The space it occupied returned to the dull green of the crops and the low light of evening, as if the air had never held anything at all. I felt my hands tighten on the wheel. "Okay," I muttered. "Okay, no." I slowed almost to a stop, eyes scanning the field where it had hovered. I half expected it to reappear or pop up behind a row farther down, but the field stayed empty. Wind brushed through the corn, rustling leaves softly. The normal quiet of farmland returned. Still, the sense of something lingering didn't fade. I started driving again, faster now. The rest of the road felt stretched out, like my mind refused to go back into normal mode. Every shadow between the rows felt heavier, like it might move again. A mile or so down, I glanced back in my rearview mirror. Nothing, just dust, distant sky, and empty road. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been a reflection from the angle of the sun. Maybe a drone. Maybe something small and weird that just happened to look wrong. But the way it hadn't cast any light bothered me. Everything that glows lights something else. This thing didn't touch the world around it at all. When I finally reached the outskirts of town, the usual sight of streetlights and houses eased some of the tension in my shoulders. I passed the old feed store and the gas station where I sometimes stopped for coffee, pretending everything felt normal again. Still, every now and then I caught myself checking the edge of the fields as I drove through, just to see if that same pale glow would slide back into view. It didn't. By the time I parked in my driveway, the sky had deepened into blue-gray. Crickets had started up. A soft breeze passed through the trees. I sat there a moment, with the engine off, listening to the quiet tick of cooling metal. "You saw something weird," I whispered, mostly to myself. Inside, the house felt warm and steady, familiar. My dog, Palmer, greeted me at the door like always, tail wagging lazily. The normalness of everything grounded me enough to stop replaying that floating light for a minute. After dinner, though, when the sky fully darkened and the land returned to shadow, curiosity tugged again. I stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the same direction of farmland, trying to spot anything out of place. The fields lay dark and calm. No light, no movement, just a wide stretch of quiet, breathing earth. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the night sounds soak in, trying to convince myself the moment had passed. But somewhere deep down, a part of me stayed alert, like the night itself had shown me a side of it I wasn't supposed to fully understand. When I finally went inside and shut the door, the sense followed faintly behind me, invisible and unanswered, like a soft echo left suspended over the land I knew too well. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was just a trick of the light. I was sitting on a flat rock near the edge of Willowmere Lake, the quiet little spot about 20 minutes outside Fairhaven that no one really bothered with anymore. It was late afternoon, the sky overcast but bright enough to see everything clearly. A light breeze rolled across the water, pushing small ripples toward the shore, and the air smelled faintly like damp leaves and cold stone. Fall had just started to lean in, and the trees along the edge of the lake were beginning to lose their color. My name's Nolan Pierce, and I'd gone out there to kill time more than anything. Work had been rough all week, and I just wanted somewhere still enough to sit without hearing someone talk at me. The surface of the lake looked normal at first, dull gray water reflecting a soft blanket of clouds. Occasionally a leaf would drift by, or a fish would break the surface and vanish again. Then something moved beneath it. Not a splash, not a ripple. A dull reflection, like a shadow sliding under the water, shifted sideways just a few feet from where I was sitting. It wasn't dark enough to be a branch. It wasn't sharp the way a fish's body flashes in the sun. It was more like a blurred shape, moving slow and smooth, like something passing under frosted glass. I leaned forward slightly, narrowing my eyes. The shape faded almost immediately, melting back into the flat gray of the lake before I could fully focus on what it had been. I waited. Nothing else appeared right away. I told myself it had probably been a cloud reflection changing with the ripple pattern, something natural, something forgettable. But my eyes stayed fixed on the same patch of water. A minute passed, then two. Just when I'd started relaxing again, it came back. The reflection slid through the water again, this time a little farther out, moving horizontally, steady and calm. No splashing, no disturbance, just a shifting tone beneath the surface, like something passing between layers. My stomach tightened. "What is that?" I murmured, leaning closer to the edge. The dull shape wavered and disappeared once more. The water flattened out again, returning to its normal muted sheen. I stayed perfectly still, barely blinking, waiting for it to come back. The lake felt suddenly bigger, deeper. A faint sound of leaves crunching behind me made my shoulders tense, but when I glanced back, no one was there. Just the dirt path winding through the trees, empty and quiet. I looked back to the water. Still nothing. The breeze shifted slightly, brushing cold air across my skin. The surface of the lake rippled softly, reflecting the gray sky without disturbance. Just as I started to feel ridiculous for getting worked up over nothing, a longer stretch of shadow appeared beneath the surface, darker than before, passing slowly from left to right. It moved too evenly to be drifting debris, too smoothly to be a fish. It looked deliberate. I sat frozen, watching it glide under the water like something pacing just beneath where I could see. It didn't break the surface, it didn't form waves. It just passed and then softly dissolved like the earlier ones. My heartbeat picked up, slow and loud in my ears. I crouched down closer, careful not to slip on the rock, scanning for any visible source. The bottom of the lake wasn't visible that close to shore. It just darkened quickly into murky depth. A chill crept up my arms. The air went strangely still, like even the wind had paused. Then another ripple began, but not from the surface. It felt like motion underneath, like a silent displacement, like a heavy presence shifting position. The dull reflection turned up one more time, closer now, around 15 feet out. It lingered slightly longer than before, then faded away into nothing. I exhaled slowly. "Okay, I'm done," I muttered. I picked up my bag and started backing away from the shoreline, eyes still locked on the water. Every step felt heavier than usual, like the ground had become less reliable. Behind me, the forest remained quiet. No bird calls, no insects, just the faint hum of the water brushing gently against rock. I turned once more, just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. The lake's surface looked calm and unremarkable. Then the water dimmed slightly in one narrow stretch, a faint path of shade that slid beneath the reflection of the clouds. It faded before I could pinpoint its shape. My chest tightened again. I stepped back farther until my boots hit dry dirt. Nothing else appeared. Still, I stayed there longer than I should have, staring at the same open water as if trying to catch whatever moved beneath it again. Eventually, the normal sounds of the place returned. Leaves shifting, a distant crow calling out, a faint rumble of a car far down the road. The tension eased just slightly. I finally turned away and walked back along the trail toward the parking area, but something about that lake didn't feel the same anymore. Halfway up the path, I heard a soft splash behind me. Not a big one, just a light disturbance. I froze, heart thudding again. The trees stayed still, no new movement. I turned slowly. The water surface now lay smooth and innocent again, no sign of whatever had slipped beneath it. I stared for a long moment, waiting for more. Nothing came. The trust I'd had in that quiet little lake felt cracked in a way I couldn't explain. The drive home passed uneventfully, but I kept picturing the way that dull reflection had moved, like something navigating a deeper world I had no access to. That night, when I lay in bed, I kept thinking of that slow glide under the surface, the way it never fully revealed itself and never stirred the water above it. Even now, when I pass by lakes and ponds, I catch myself watching just a little longer than before, waiting for that muted shadow to reappear, slipping silently beneath the surface and away before reality has time to understand it. A muffled thump hit the roof hard enough that the light fixture over my kitchen sink rattled. I froze mid-step, one hand still gripping my phone, listening for whatever came next. The house went back to its usual low hum. Fridge running, faint tick of the clock, nothing out of place. No second impact, no sound of anything sliding or rolling off, just silence. It was a little after midnight, and the storm clouds that had been hanging around all evening finally cleared enough to show a few dim stars. I'd stepped into the kitchen to grab water before bed when the sound came from directly above, near the back edge of the roof. My name's Caleb Rivas. I lived alone in a small rental on the outskirts of Maple Glen, a quiet wooded neighborhood with narrow streets and spaced out houses. Nothing dramatic ever happened there. The loudest thing most nights was a dog barking 2 streets over. Another few seconds passed, and the silence started to feel wrong. I set the phone down and walked to the back door, peering through the glass into the yard. The porch light cast a soft circle over the grass and the old oak near the fence line. Everything appeared normal. Still, the uneasy weight in my chest didn't lift. So I slipped on my sneakers and stepped outside. The air felt cool and dry, about that kind of crisp night air that settles in after rain. No wind, no insects buzzing, no rustling branches. My yard looked exactly as it always did. Then I looked up. A pale glow hung faintly above the roofline, just past the edge of the shingles. Dim, almost ghostly, but definitely there. It wasn't bright enough to flood the area, just enough to be noticeable against the dark sky. It hovered completely still for a second. Then it drifted upward. Not like something thrown. Not fast like a drone or helicopter, just a slow, deliberate glide, rising higher as if pulled gently by something beyond sight. I walked a few more steps into the yard without thinking, eyes locked on it. The glow tightened slightly, becoming more concentrated, then slipped further into the sky. As it climbed, the light grew fainter, almost blending with the gray-black clouds until it vanished completely. The night fell quiet again. No sound of engines, no rush of air, nothing. I stood there for another minute, waiting for some rational explanation to reveal itself, but it didn't. Finally, I muttered, "What the hell was that?" to nobody and headed back inside. I checked the roof from the upstairs window after, expecting maybe a fallen branch or loose shingle, but everything looked intact. No debris, no marks, no sign of anything landing or sliding. I went to bed with the feeling brushing lightly at the back of my mind, like someone standing just out of view. Sleep didn't come easily. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint vibration, subtle enough that I almost dismissed it as part of a dream. The glass of water on my nightstand shivered slightly, ripples barely forming on the surface. The vibration faded after a few seconds. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening. Nothing followed. The next day, everything seemed normal again. Sunlight filled the yard, birds chirped, the neighborhood carried on quietly. I told myself it had probably been a raccoon or something heavy bumping against the house, but even that didn't fit right. Raccoons didn't float away, glowing. That evening, while taking out the trash, my neighbor Marissa from across the street waved at me. "You hear that weird noise last night?" she asked casually. I hesitated. "Yeah, something hit my roof." She nodded slowly. "Same. Thought a branch fell or something, but I couldn't see anything. Woke me up." I didn't tell her about the glow. Instead, I just said, "Probably just wind or something weird." She shrugged and went back inside. But later that night, as I stood at my bedroom window, I kept glancing toward the stretch of sky above my roof. Nothing happened for a while. Then around 11, there it was again. A faint smear of light appearing low above the tree line behind the house. It didn't move at first. Just hovered there, this pulsing so softly, I almost missed it. The air inside my room felt thick, and the usual nighttime sounds seemed muted. I cracked the window open slightly. A cool breeze slipped in, but the outside atmosphere felt strangely still, almost heavy. The glow slowly shifted sideways, careful and smooth, like it was following something invisible. As it moved, a low hum barely whispered through the air, not loud enough to be a sound so much as a sensation. My skin prickled. The light paused, then rose, gliding back toward where it had disappeared before. No speed, no urgency, just a calm drift skyward. I watched it the entire time until it vanished into the dark. The hum faded again, leaving only the night. I stood by that window long after, heart still pressing oddly against my chest, trying to understand what I kept seeing. Over the next few days, things continued subtly wrong. The porch light flickered once and went out, only lasting a few seconds before turning back on. My phone occasionally lost signal in the yard and regained it instantly without explanation. The air sometimes felt heavier near the back of the house, especially close to the oak tree. A few more nights passed, then, one evening, just after 10, another muffled impact hit the roof. Softer this time, but still noticeable. I was ready for it now. I stepped outside again. This time the faint glow didn't hesitate. It hovered a few feet above the roofline, slowly moving in a lazy arc, as if observing something below. The air around it looked slightly distorted, rippling the same way heat warps distant pavement. I took 2 slow steps forward, careful. The hum returned, gentle, steady, not threatening, but deeply unsettling. The glow lifted higher, then drifted away into the dark sky once more, leaving nothing behind except the quiet. No marks, no damage, no proof. I survived every encounter, but the sense of being seen lingered long after the glow vanished. And even now, every night, When the yard falls silent and the wind goes still, I catch myself staring up toward the roofline, waiting for that soft light to return for reasons I still don't understand. A soft glow pressed through the edges of my curtains, thin and pale, like someone had parked a car right outside and left the high beams on. I squinted at it, still half in that heavy, fuzzy sleep where everything feels slow. I checked my phone on the nightstand. It read 2:18 a.m., no notifications, no missed calls, just the time and the dull blue screen. The glow didn't pulse or move. It just stayed there, seeping in around the fabric in a way that felt wrong somehow. Too even. Too quiet. I rolled onto my back and listened. No engines. No footsteps. No voices outside. Just the low hum of my fridge through the wall and the faint ticking of the old heater. After a few seconds, curiosity won out over comfort. I pushed myself up and crept over to the window, bare feet cold against the floorboards. I slid the curtain aside slowly, expecting to see a car or maybe some weirdo shining a flashlight around the yard. Instead, I saw the pale glow lifting upward. It rose straight up past the top of the window frame, soundless, smooth, like a dim orb or dome drifting into the dark. No flicker, no trail. Just a quiet retreat into the cloudy sky until the night swallowed it. The backyard looked normal again. My fence, the patch of overgrown grass, the crooked old bird bath. No source for the light anywhere. I stood there, curtain still in my hand, staring out like I'd missed something important by a second. My name's Adrian Velez. I lived alone in a rented duplex just outside Port Angeles, close enough to hear the distant waves when the wind shifted right. It had been drizzling earlier that evening, the kind of light coastal rain that left everything damp and smelling slightly metallic already, but this felt different. I cracked the window open a few inches and leaned out. Cold air rolled in, salty and wet. No fresh light, no noise. Just darkness and the soft murmur of far-off surf. I waited. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I shut the window and pulled the curtains closed. I stood there a while longer, listening for an engine start or footsteps on wet gravel, but the night stayed still. Back in bed, sleep didn't come easy. Every tiny sound made my eyes snap open. The old floor creaking in the hallway, the pipes shifting as the heater kicked on and off. I kept glancing back at the curtains, half expecting that glow to seep through again. It didn't. When I finally drifted off, it was shallow and restless. The next morning was gray and foggy, the kind of fog that smeared the outline of everything and made distance hard to judge. I convinced myself maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Half dream, half reflection of passing headlights. That happens sometimes. But when I stepped out onto the back porch to take the trash out, I noticed the grass right beneath my bedroom window looked flattened in a neat circular patch. Not trampled, exactly, just gently bent, like something had pressed down evenly and then lifted away. I crouched, running my fingers over the damp blades. No footprints, no tire tracks, just that smooth, shallow depression in the grass. I shook it off and went about my day. By afternoon, I was back at my job on the docks, unloading shipments with my coworker Mateo away, trying not to think about it. But all day I caught myself glancing up at the low clouds, scanning for anything out of place. Nothing appeared. That evening, I mentioned it casually to my neighbor Denise while we both checked our mail. "You ever see weird lights around here at night?" I asked, trying to sound normal. She laughed softly. "Only the usual drunk tourists and their flashlights." "Why?" "Just thought I saw something last night. Probably a reflection." She shrugged and shuffled back inside, not concerned at all. The next few nights passed quietly, enough to lull me even more into thinking it had been a fluke. But then, 3 days later, it happened again. This time, I wasn't asleep. I'd been lying on the couch watching a rerun with the volume low when the living room slowly filled with that same pale light. It crept across the carpet and up the walls like fog made of glow. I muted the TV and sat up straight. The glow wasn't harsh. It wasn't warm either, just steady and dim enough to notice. I approached the sliding glass door that looked out to the backyard. Outside, floating just above the fence line, a rounded haze of light hung completely still. No shape I could clearly define, but not just mist either. It held its form in an unnatural way, like it had edges that my eyes refused to focus on. My throat tightened. I stood there frozen, hand hovering over the door handle, unsure whether opening it was the worst decision or the only way to prove I wasn't losing it. The glow slid sideways, slow and deliberate, tracing along the top of the fence before drifting upward again into the fog, dissolving without a sound. The backyard returned to darkness. I looked at my phone again. 11:36 p.m. This time, the signal bars flickered and dropped to zero before settling back. A chill crept along my arms. The air felt heavier for a moment, pressed flat and still. Even the distant ocean noise seemed to fade. I didn't open the door, I just stood there until my legs started shaking. That night, I double-checked every lock, every latch, every window. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the curtains slightly open, eyes fixed on the glass, replaying that silent upward drift over and over. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint vibration through the floor, almost like a large truck passing, except there was no rumble to go with it. Just enough motion to make the water in the bedside glass ripple slightly. Then it stopped. No glow this time, no light, just subtle silence again. I stayed awake for hours, staring, listening, trying to piece together what kind of normal thing could cause all of this. Morning came slow and colorless. The fog clung to the edges of everything. I stepped outside again and noticed the same subtle flattening in the grass, extended farther this time, wider, almost like an impression from something round, but too light to leave actual marks. I felt embarrassed even thinking of it, but I still took a photo on my phone. When I checked the image later, the patch looked less defined than I remembered, just slightly darker grass. The following night, I didn't see the glow, but I smelled it instead. That cold metallic scent drifted faintly through my bedroom, sharp and clean, nothing like damp soil or ocean air. It lingered for a minute, then vanished as if someone had shut a door on it. I sat up, heart hammering, listening for movement outside. Nothing came. By the end of the week, I started wondering if the house itself felt different, like some part of my space was being observed quietly, without urgency, just a presence that arrived, hovered, and left. Then one night, it returned for the last time. I lay in bed with my eyes half closed when the pale glow pushed through the edges of my curtains again. Soft, steady, familiar in a way that made my pulse race. I slid the curtains open. The light hovered higher this time, just beyond the roofline, casting a faint sheen over the wet shingles and fence. Then slowly it lifted, as if responding to nothing but its own quiet timing, and drifted into the cloud cover above. The sky sealed behind it. The street stayed empty. No voices, no engines, just the distant hush of the ocean and the soft creak of my old house settling. I closed the curtains and stood there a long time, letting my eyes adjust back to darkness, trying to make any kind of sense of it all. Nothing else happened after that. No more pressing glow, no humming, no strange patches in the yard. But some nights, when the fog hung low and the curtains stirred slightly in the breeze, I still found myself staring at the window, waiting for that soft, shapeless light to quietly slide upward again. The clouds had been drifting lazily across the sky until one patch just stopped. I was lying on my back on the dry grass behind my townhouse, hands folded over my stomach, using my hoodie as a makeshift pillow. It was one of those late summer afternoons where the heat hadn't fully broken yet, but the worst of it had passed. The air felt thick and warm, buzzing faintly with distant traffic and cicadas. The kind of quiet that usually made it easy to zone out. My name's Jordan Pruitt, and I'd lived in this cul-de-sac in Somerset Ridge for about 3 years. Normal place. Kids riding scooters, dogs barking at fences, lawn sprinklers clicking on and off like clockwork. I'd been watching the clouds drift slowly above, not really thinking much, just letting my eyes follow the gentle motion. Then I noticed one of them wasn't moving. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a pale gray patch, roughly oval-shaped, sitting slightly off-center above the neighboring rooftops. Everything else slid right past it, shifting shape and drifting west the way clouds normally do. But this one didn't budge. I squinted, tracking it for a full minute to make sure it wasn't my imagination. It stayed fixed in the same spot, like it was pinned to the sky. My heartbeat ticked up slightly. "That's weird," I muttered. A faint wind tugged at the trees along the fences. Leaves rustled. A lawn chair tipped slightly against my leg. Normal stuff. But that patch of sky remained still. And then a dim light pulsed inside it. Not bright, not sharp. just a soft, dull glow that flickered once from within the cloud mass, barely visible through its gray surface. I froze. The glow vanished almost immediately, leaving the cloud dull and blank again. I sat up, propping myself on my elbows, eyes never leaving that spot above. "What are you doing?" I whispered under my breath. The rest of the clouds continued their slow drift, reshaping as they passed, but that one stubborn section held its place like it refused to follow the same rules. Then the light pulsed again, slightly stronger this time. Still not enough to light anything around it, just enough to confirm that something inside that cloud was aware enough to announce itself. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere 2 yards over, but the sound felt distant. I got to my feet slowly, not sure why standing felt safer than lying down. The cloud patch remained unnaturally still. Another faint pulse flickered. Then darkness again. No thunder, no aircraft sound, no change in wind. I grabbed my phone from the ground and checked the time. 6:41 p.m. I considered recording it but hesitated. Something about the moment felt too delicate, like trying to capture it might make it vanish or somehow escalate. A breeze passed, warm and slow, brushing my arms. I looked away for 2 seconds, just to check if anyone else in the neighborhood noticed. No one stood outside. No voices. No movement. When I looked back up, the cloud still hadn't shifted. But now the glow inside it lingered a moment longer before fading, almost like the light hesitated. My stomach twisted into a tighter knot. I couldn't tell if fear or curiosity was driving me at that point. The sky around it began looking slightly darker, just the contrast growing more noticeable, like that one patch controlled the brightness of everything near it. I took a slow step backward without realizing I'd started moving. The light flickered again, this time a short series of faint pulses, uneven and subtle, like something struggling to break through the cloud cover. Then went dark. The cloud held steady a few moments more, and finally it drifted. Not smoothly, not gradually like the others. It slid sideways just a hair, enough that I noticed it breaking its perfect stillness. The rest of the clouds seemed to relax again around it, flowing naturally. The light didn't appear again. A sensation of tension faded slightly in my chest, but my eyes remained glued to the sky. Minutes passed. The clouds slowly began to dissolve, its edges thinning until it became just another irregular shape, merging with the rest. Nothing happened after that. The world slipped back into its normal rhythm like it had never paused. Still, I didn't trust the calm. I stayed standing there, breathing slow, watching the sky like it might behave strangely again. Eventually, a neighbor walked past the fence with their phone to their ear, chatting casually. Somewhere, the faint whir of a lawnmower rose and fell. I forced myself to sit back down, though my muscles stayed tense. The rest of the evening passed without further disturbance, but the moment replayed itself over and over in my mind. Later, once dusk pushed the orange hue out of the sky and replaced it with cool purple-gray, I noticed another subtle change. The same section of sky from earlier looked faintly darker than everything else above it. Not a cloud this time, just a dim pocket of stillness. I leaned back against the patio chair and watched. It stayed motionless for almost 5 minutes. Then, for the briefest moment, a weak light flared inside it again. No flash, just presence. Then darkness reclaimed it. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just watched the sky and let the unease simmer in silence. It never returned that night. Over the next few days, I kept finding excuses to glance upward when I stepped outside. Most of the time, everything looked normal. But sometimes, in passing, my eyes would linger at that same section of sky just a second too long, waiting for something that might never come again. Nothing like it ever repeated exactly. The clouds flowed like clouds should. The wind felt normal. But every now and then, when the light hit just right and the sky looked a little too calm, I felt that same small prickle of awareness crawling up my spine, like the sky itself had briefly woken up, and then pretended nothing had happened. The feeling hit first, like someone had stepped too close behind me without making a sound. I didn't hear anything, but I knew, in a way that made no sense, that something was up there, above the trees. I slowed down and tilted my head back. For a split second, I saw a tiny point of light hanging in the clouds. Then it slid behind a thicker patch and disappeared. I stood on the Crescent Ridge Trail just outside Taos, halfway between the lower switchbacks and the narrow overlook. The sun had already dropped behind the mountains, leaving that gray-blue light that makes everything feel flat and quiet. The air smelled damp from earlier rain, and the dirt had just enough moisture to make my boots crunch but not stick. I hadn't planned on staying out this late. I'd told my sister Maribel I'd be back before dark, but the hike had taken longer than I thought. I figured one more stretch before heading back wouldn't hurt. Still, that tiny light had pulled my attention straight up, even though there was no reason for it. I waited, staring at the clouds, expecting it to reappear. Nothing did. The sky just looked heavy and low, like it was about to sink into the tops of the pines. I shook it off and started walking again. A few steps in, I realized the wind had stopped completely. Not faded, just gone. The branches above me froze mid-sway, and the usual night critter sounds dropped away. No bugs, no distant birds, no rustling. I checked my phone. Signal was gone, which wasn't unusual up here, but the screen brightness dimmed on its own, then brightened again. I adjusted it back, slightly annoyed, and kept moving. Another strange thing. The trail markers I recognized looked a little off, turned sideways like someone had nudged them just enough to look wrong. I stopped beside one and corrected it, then noticed the one further up the path pointing the same slightly crooked angle. A dull hum started, so faint I almost thought it was my breathing. I paused and listened. It didn't come from any direction. It just filled the space around me for a few seconds, then softened until I could barely tell if I'd imagined it. I took a few more steps and felt the pressure again, that sense of being watched from above. I glanced up fast this time. Another tiny light slid between two cloud layers and vanished like it had passed behind a curtain. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was probably a satellite or some plane reflecting light wrong, but the way it moved didn't feel natural. It hadn't blinked. It had just glided. I checked behind me. The trail was empty. The forest leaned quietly inward. No voices, no footsteps. Just my own breathing and the soft scrape of boots on damp ground. When I looked back down, I noticed something that really didn't sit right. Next to my left boot print was another one, slightly shallower, same size, same pattern, but I hadn't walked side by side with anyone. I crouched to look closer. The second print stopped about 2 feet ahead, then picked up again a few steps later. I straightened slowly and scanned the trees. Still nothing. The silence around me felt thicker than before, like it pressed against my ears. I started moving again, picking up my pace this time. My phone vibrated with a delayed message from Eli, a coworker asking if I'd be in tomorrow. The timestamp said it came through 9 minutes earlier, even though I was certain the phone hadn't buzzed before now. The hum returned, a little stronger but still soft. It made the ground feel faintly alive under my feet. I stopped, swallowing hard, and looked up just as that pinpoint light reappeared, sliding across the sky and tucking itself behind another cloud layer. The wind still hadn't come back. The air smelled metallic now, sharp and dry, like right before a storm that never comes. I muttered, "All right," mostly to hear my own voice. It sounded small and thin. My words didn't travel far at all. I turned around and headed downhill. The light stayed above, reappearing every now and then, never getting closer but never vanishing fully either. Each time I noticed it, that tight certainty returned, like it was tracking the path I moved along. Halfway down the trail, my headlamp flickered and briefly went dim. I tapped it and it steadied again, but I could feel my heart thudding harder now. The forest seemed unfamiliar, even though I'd walked this route dozens of times. I checked my watch. It said 8:42. I felt like I couldn't have been hiking that long, but the sky suggested otherwise. 5 minutes later, I checked again. It read 8:53. I reached a clearing where the trees opened into a small stretch of rock and low brush. The clouds above moved slowly again, but the air below stayed dead still. The tiny light hovered once more, brighter than before, then slipped away behind the cloud mass like it had never been there. The hum dropped out completely. The silence that followed felt wrong, too smooth, like the world had been muted. I didn't wait around after that. I kept moving, faster now, not running but steady. The trail finally widened, and I could see the faint glow of parked cars down near the base. Real light. Normal light. As I made my way down the final slope, the wind returned in small gusts, carrying the normal mountain smells with it. Leaves rustled, and somewhere a bird chirped once. It all felt like someone had flipped a switch back on. When I reached my car, I stood there for a moment, breathing out slowly, waiting for that strange pressure to return. It didn't. The sky looked ordinary again, just clouds and dark. I drove home without checking the rear view too much, even though the urge stayed there. Inside my apartment, everything sounded normal. The fridge hummed, the floorboards creaked, and my phone finally showed full signal again. Later, laying on my couch, I checked the photos I'd randomly snapped during the hike. Most were blurred or dark, but one, taken when I didn't remember lifting my phone, showed the tree line and a faint point of light higher than it should have been, softened by cloud. I turned the screen off and set it face down, letting the quiet settle back in around me, knowing I had no clue what I'd seen. Just the feeling that whatever it was had been calmly watching from somewhere above the clouds.